Roll 'em. And we're live. Stream seems to be having some difficulty catching here, folks.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Hey, welcome to Strange Bedfellows. Sorry for the awkward start. StreamYard's been acting very weird today. Anyway, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm your host, Lori Spencer. My usual co-host, Rick Walker, is taking the night off for a little family time. And I'm going to be flying this thing, well, not exactly by myself. I do have a co-pilot who's become very well known to our viewers here at Maverick News. Anytime we want to talk about the Kennedys or JFK, we always like to turn to our friend James DiEugenio. And welcome back, Jim, all the way from Los Angeles, California.
Thank you so much for having me, Lori.
How's the weather in Los Angeles tonight?
It's a little chilly tonight, about 50.
That's kind of chilly for LA.
It is.
It's cold here in Oklahoma, too. It's a cold, rainy night. It's like 32 degrees and a little freezing
Now, that's
rain.
really cold.
Yeah.
Now, that's cold.
We got a little sleet here tonight, actually, hitting my window pane as we talk. So it's good to have you back, my friend. And for those of you out there who might not be familiar with Jim, maybe you missed some of our previous interviews with him. We're bringing him back tonight because, of course, we've been doing a month of special coverage for the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And tonight we're doing a special 2-hour edition of Strange Bedfellows. This is episode 22, most appropriately, as President Kennedy was shot on November 22nd, 1963. It's just strange that's the way the numbers worked out tonight. Jim DiEugenio is here tonight. We're going to take a deep dive into all this evidence that's presented in his new book. And the book is just out, I think, last week. It's called The JFK Assassination Chokeholds That Prove There Was a Conspiracy. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. As you probably know, Jim collaborated with Oliver Stone on the documentary film JFK Revisited and JFK Destiny Betrayed. Also wrote the accompanying book. He's the author of, I guess, 5 books now about the assassinations of the 1960s, the Kennedy presidency, and the Cold War. He's editor-in-chief at kennedysandking.com, which is one of my favorite websites. I highly recommend it. There's some really great articles there. You could spend hours and hours reading about this subject if you're interested in it and learn so much new stuff that you didn't know before. And Jim, let's dive right in. What has your week been like? Probably very busy. You've been doing the rounds, doing a lot of interviews. You went to Duquesne University for that Cyril Wecht conference. How did all that go?
Well, actually, I did a speech in Cincinnati before I went to Duquesne. All right.
Cool.
That was on, I think, November the 14th. I did a speech at the Mercantile Library there. And Matt Crumpton, one of the co-authors on this book, the JFK Assassination Chokeholds, he's the one who got me that speech, which I really like because that's where my sister lives. I haven't seen her in a long time, so she came down to see me. And then I did it was a very big conference in Pittsburgh at Duquesne University, which Cyril Wecht's son ran, Ben. Cyril's like 92 or 93 years old now.
Yes, he
but
is.
They had a lot of very good speakers there. Alec Baldwin was there one night. Rob Reiner came in by Zoom. All right. And John Newman was there. Jeff Morley was there. All right. And David Talbot came in. He was the last speaker.
Great.
All right. Among many, many. Doug Horn was there. He used to work for the ARB.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so that was very interesting.
Love it.
That was like 3 days or something. All right. And I've done numerous, so many more, I can't even count them. I was actually on Fox, if you can believe it.
As a
Okay.
matter of fact, I know because I saw that and
Oh, you saw that?
I brought the video, Jim.
Did you
I
fall
brought
off
the
your chair?
video. My eyes popped out when I saw your face on the thumbnail. I was like, there he is on Fox News.
What's
But
Jim doing on Fox?
you've been on Fox a few times, right? I saw
Well,
you on Jesse Waters
actually, there
before.
was, that I did one with Jesse Waters. Then
Uh-huh.
me and Oliver did one that really wasn't on Fox Network. It was on their website. Okay. And that was to publicize the film. And by the way, let me say this about the film. JFK Revisited has now sold in 13 foreign countries. Okay. We just sold in Japan about a
Mhm.
month or two ago. Okay. Along with Macau and Hong Kong. All right. And we
Mhm.
actually opened a Tokyo Film Festival. All right. And they actually brought in a couple of experts in Japan on the JFK case to talk about it.
You
That
know, that makes a lot of sense because the Japanese love JFK. He's really popular in Japan. I'm not exactly sure why, but they just love President Kennedy in Japan. It's a big
See,
thing over there.
this has to be, I never expected this film to be. And by the way, on November 22nd, the day of Kennedy's assassination, it was number 4 on Amazon for
I saw that.
documentary sales. And
Yeah.
this picture has been out a year in
Mhm.
DVD, 2 years since it was released at the Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah.
For a documentary, that's really, really impressive, I think.
I think so too. But
Yeah.
I don't believe it when people try to say, "Oh, nobody cares about JFK anymore." I mean, if anything, this 60th anniversary shows you all
Yes.
around the world how much people really do care. And there's all these new documentaries out, and you've got that Rob Reiner podcast that's incredibly popular. I think that was trending at number one, number two last week on Apple and
Well,
all the major podcasting.
he's done a lot of media. He's been on 2
A
or
lot.
3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He
Yeah,
was
he's done a
everywhere
lot of
last
media.
week.
Yeah. See,
Yeah.
the thing is, what I like to note about this, at were you in Dallas at the 50th?
I was. Yeah.
Okay. See, we got blasted at the 50th anniversary. It was one of the most humiliating, one of the most
Mm,
sickening displays of Operation Mockingbird that I've ever
yes.
seen in my life. Okay, if
Yes.
you recall, and you probably do, but maybe your listeners don't know this, the powers that be in Dallas blocked off the whole Dealey Plaza area. You
That's right.
literally could not get in. They
Mhm.
put up horses. I don't mean actually horses, although there were guys on
There
horseback.
were guys on horseback,
Yeah, that's right.
cops.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
cops were
there
on
were those
horseback.
carpentry sawhorses, and they
Mhm.
blocked off every entrance into Dealey Plaza.
That's right.
All right, and only
Oh, and to get in.
only you could only get in if you submitted your name to Homeland Security.
Right.
Now, I didn't submit my name because I knew they would never let me in. Okay,
Oh, and
so
they didn't want just your name. They wanted everything about you. They wanted to know where you lived, where you worked, how you voted. I mean,
yeah.
I had to fill out one of those questionnaires to get
Oh,
media.
you tried to get in?
I tried to get a media pass.
Did you get in?
Um, I did, but
Oh my God!
I
How
didn't
did?
stay in because it sucked. It was terrible. It was
Mhm.
freezing cold. All they had was the Navy choir and some boring speeches. And I
Mhm.
knew that all the action and excitement was outside the gates on the streets of Dallas, where the real people were and the conspiracy theorists were, because they'd locked all you guys out, like
Right,
you and Robert Groden and all the usual people who hold, vigil on the grassy knoll every year since 1964. They closed the plaza to the general public. Only the elites could get in, and people who were willing to go through a thorough background check by the feds. And of course, nobody wanted to consent to that. Nobody I know. I didn't like it. I had to do it for my job, but I hated it. I was
see,
like, why?
this time it was different, and I believe there's 3 major reasons. The
Hmm.
Landis book, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The documentary, What the Doctor Saw,
It's
which
great.
is on Paramount Plus right
Really
now.
good. Really good.
And Rob Reiner making all these visits to places like CNN and MSNBC, etc. So this time around, it's a little bit more even-handed than it
Hmm.
was at that humiliating experience. You know where I was watching that? I don't even want to. Oh God,
I
David
bumped into you down there on the 50th
David
briefly.
David McCullough. What is David
Ah,
McCullough doing making an address? He's never written anything of any
nothing.
significance on JFK.
No, nothing about the
Okay.
Kennedys. No.
So here I was stuck in a coffee shop, about a block away from Dealey Plaza,
That's
watching this because it was being blasted all over every network on TV at that time,
that's
you
right.
know? So anyway, I'm glad this time around, okay, it was a little bit more, evenly distributed than it was at that humiliating 50th.
Yeah, that was good to see. I was concerned too that they were going to try and do it again and close off the plaza like they did on the 50th. But they didn't. They kept it open to the public this year.
Oh,
And
really? I didn't know that.
yep, it was open to the public. There was no seating, like last time they had all those chairs and,
Hmm.
to set up for the stage and none of that. It just looked like, regular Dealey Plaza. And it was nice to see that people were allowed to, it was so unpopular. I mean, when they did that for the 50th, the city took a lot of criticism about it, rightly so. So thankfully they changed their ways
If
and
you
they,
remember, and you probably do, at the 50th, they actually set up a whole bunch of trailers for all the media that came into Dallas on that day because it
mm-hmm,
was literally from all over the world.
yep,
Okay. And I believe that's the reason that they did not want anybody like me or Groden, or John Newman or
that's right.
anybody
No,
like that.
they didn't want you talking to the press. In
Right.
fact,
Exactly. Right.
I had to come find you guys specifically. I was writing a piece for Yahoo News, and I was, I'm a JFK conspiracy theorist, so I
Mhm.
wanted to go find you and Bob Groden, and I knew you guys were speaking at a couple of the conferences there, and I was just, trying to get quotes out of each of you, and I
Mhm.
got to accost you briefly, got a brief quote from you while I was freezing cold and had to dash to stay warm. It
Uh-huh.
was like a freak sleet storm for Dallas. Usually Dallas is warm in November.
Mhm.
The weather's usually nice for those JFK conferences every November, but not that year. We had
No.
like a ice falling from the sky, and I remember my coat was covered in icicles. It was
Mhm.
crazy, freezing cold outside, and all those people who'd gone to the trouble to attend the big ceremony, the official ceremony out in Dealey Plaza, they were miserable sitting there in the freezing cold and the sleet.
Now,
Uh,
do you know the extent they went to? They called in 200 extra officers, okay, doing on overtime to make sure nobody was going to, because behind the sawhorses there were cars,
mhm.
okay, and then if you could believe it, they were really police on horseback galloping from one entrance to another
Yep.
to make sure nobody was going to get through.
Mhm.
Okay, now, that's how secure that they wanted that thing.
And
You
they
know.
had the big couple of them, a couple of Homeland Security trucks, big trucks. God only knows what was in those trucks.
Hmm.
But crowd control weaponry. They thought the people might get out of control because Alex Jones, if you recall, came down and he had a bunch of his supporters with him, and they
Hmm.
were protesting outside the gates of Dealey Plaza, saying, let us in," and he had his bullhorn,
Yeah.
and
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
and so the Homeland Security came in and they had their weapons truck, their crowd control weapons truck, and their bomb sniffing dogs. I
Hmm.
remember that everybody who went into Dealey Plaza, if you went into the official ceremony, the dogs gave you a sniff and they
Hey.
gave you a pat down too, a full pat down. You know, I was just a reporter. I was like, it's just
Mhm.
a camera. Please don't shoot me.
So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I
Yeah.
think it's a contrast this time around. Okay.
Yes.
And
It was
and
good
and
to
I'm
see
I'm
that.
kind of glad for that, that people like Alec Baldwin showed up, people like Rob Reiner are trying. And this documentary, I don't know if you've seen it. What the Doctor Saw. Did you
Yes.
see it yet?
Yeah, in fact, we did a episode of Strange Bedfellows last weekend about JFK60, and we talked quite a bit about what the doctors saw. Played some clips from it.
Okay, I
Yeah.
I saw this approximately 2 years ago when me and Oliver were preparing JFK Revisited, and Bob Tannenbaum is one of the talking hens in the movie,
Hmm.
and he was the deputy chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He invited me to his house to go ahead and watch this thing. Now, what they've added to it this time around is Doug Horn and Matt Crumpton, one of my co-authors on this book, which we'll talk about sooner or later. All right. And what the doctors saw was actually sold, rather optioned to CBS. The producer of the program told me that once Leslie Moonves got fired,
Hmm.
okay, CBS did not go through, on the deal for whatever reason. But thanks for this streaming service, we are now able to see this film, and it's I believe that it's one of the most interesting aspects of the JFK case, and that's why we spent some time on it in JFK Revisited, and why I wrote a whole chapter on it in this book, uh, because I believe today that the mystery of Kennedy's brain and this blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull is like an avatar. It's like a a a night watchman. Okay, it's like a lighthouse in the fog that tells us what really happened to Kennedy. And I'm sure you've talked about this before, but I'll just repeat it just to set it up a little. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, in their report, tried to neuter these Dallas doctors who are featured in this film, all right, by saying that although several doctors and nurse personnel said that they saw a blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull, the people at Bethesda Medical Center, which is where the autopsy was later held that night, uh, did not see such a thing. Well, thank God for the review board,
Hmm.
because they declassified all the documents from the House Select Committee. And lo and behold, this ended up being a lie, because not only did these people at Bethesda see this blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's skull, they drew illustrations of it
Hmm.
for the House Select Committee. And Gary Aguilar, who's a physician in San Francisco, a good researcher, he tallied it up. And he said between the two locations, something like 40 people saw this blasted out hole in the back of Kennedy's head. Now, for people who don't understand what this means, this is like JFK 101. Entering bullets leaves small holes. Okay. All right. But when they go through a body, because they pick up all this resistance and all this tissue and all this blood, etc. Okay. When they leave the body, they usually end up leaving a large, expansive, avulsive wound. So it has all the indications of being an exit wound. All right. And so this is one of the things I believe. I don't see how anybody else can disagree with me. The House Select Committee tried to cover this up, but it's a fact. All right. Now the other thing directly related to this, and something that I wrote a chapter of in the book. Kennedy's brain at autopsy weighed 1,500 grams. That's the first recorded weight that we see in the record, 1,500 grams. Right there, it's a problem, because the average weight of a brain of a male of that age is 1340.
Hmm.
Okay. So it's 160 grams more than it should be. Now, if that isn't enough for you, how in God's name can Kennedy's brain weigh more than the average when, in fact, anybody with two eyes can see the Zapruder film? where Kennedy's head explodes. Okay. And you get
Mm.
this jet stream going up in the air. When in fact, if you look in the pictures of the back seat of the car, there's all this blood.
That's where most of it went.
Right.
Yeah.
There's all this blood and tissue on the back seat of the car.
Mhm.
Jackie Kennedy reaches out under the trunk of the car to retrieve a piece of his skull, which, by the way, she did. She
Yeah.
did, and she gave it to one of the doctors.
Handed it to a doctor like, "Will this help?"
Yeah, this is my husband's head.
Mm.
Okay. One of the cyclists on the left side of Kennedy. All right. And that's important. It's just on the left side of Kennedy. Okay. Hargis said he got hit so hard that he thought he was hit by a bullet. And then somebody said, "You have a piece of Kennedy's head in your mouth." And he actually pulled it out of his mouth because he didn't know what it was. Okay.
Oh.
All right. Now remember, that's on the left side of Kennedy. Okay. So how could that come from the rear? And wouldn't that indicate a shot from the grassy knoll area if it's on the left side of the car? So
Unless it was an incredibly windy day, but it wasn't.
maybe a hurricane.
Very
Okay.
light winds. Yeah, it'd have to be pretty gale force winds
so
to
now, so
do that.
now, now, not only do you have the above average, but you have this. I would say is a physical impossibility for somebody to be hit in the head like that, lose all this, organs, tissue, blood, and still come in at above the average. But here's level number 3. You had like 11 or 12 witnesses who actually saw Kennedy's brain. Some of them saw it through this big hole in the back of his head. Then there were the doctors who saw it at Bethesda. All right. And they all said there was a significant missing mass of Kennedy's brain. Like about 1/3 of it, was missing. All right. So if you have these kind of witnesses, that kind of visual evidence, and the fact of the matter that brain weight I just told you about, that wasn't recorded that night. Do you believe that?
Yeah,
That
they
was not
waited
recorded
some
that night.
period of time to weigh the brain. Isn't that
Right.
right? Was it about a
Yeah.
month
No.
before
It
they
was it was about 2 weeks.
2
Okay, when
weeks?
when the supplementary autopsy came in, and Kennedy's brain was listed at 1,500 grams. Now, you want to hear something really funny? Michael Bauden was supposed to be the chief of the pathology panel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Years later, there was a San Francisco channel, a station, that did a special on the JFK case. They confronted him with this fact that, look, Kennedy's the weight of his brain, he didn't know it. Do you believe
Hmm,
that? He did not.
interesting.
He was shocked when
Hmm.
he saw this thing. These are the kind of people we've had investigating this case. A very key piece of evidence that he wasn't aware of till years later.
I
So,
was not aware of that, difference in the weight until I saw JFK Revisited, your film with Oliver
oh well,
Stone, where
thank you.
you yeah, I was unaware of that. I knew that
Oh,
there
wait
had
a minute.
been
Wait a
part of the
minute.
brain that went missing from the National Archives for
Well, the
years. I
brain
knew
was
about
missing.
that.
That's true.
Yeah.
But let me add one other point. Well, I almost forgot this. Thanks for reminding me. John Stringer was
Mhm.
the chief autopsy photographer. In fact, he was supposed to be officially the only autopsy photographer.
And he was
And
a
it,
Navy was he Navy photographer?
yes,
Mhm.
and thank God for the ARB, or we would have never found this out. They interviewed Doug Horn and Jeremy Gunn interviewed um, Stringer. They did a pre-interview outside the archive because they wanted to get his story down first. Okay. Then they brought him into the anteroom where the autopsy photographs were pinned up on an easel. When Stringer saw these pictures, according to Doug Horn, he got visibly upset Okay, and he walked right up to the easel and looked at them very closely. And he said, "This is Ansco. Ansco is a brand of film." Okay. Uh, I didn't use Ansco. And they had established this before. I used Kodak Ektachrome. And he says, "You see these numbers on the lower right corner here? That means this is part of a press pack. In other words, they're taken in series. All right. So they have a number on them, consecutive order. I didn't use a press pack. Okay. I use duplex folders. All right. And so Jeremy Gunn then asked him, "Are you ready to deny then that you took these pictures?" And Stringer said, "If that's Ansco and this is a press pack, I didn't take these pictures."
Hmm.
Okay. And so,
That's a problem.
I mean, how many levels of evidence do you need? Okay. Because in a court
Truly.
of law, those pictures would never be admitted. Okay. Because in a court of law,
Mhm.
you have to have the guy who's supposedly responsible for taking the pictures.
That's
He
right.
has to say, "I took those
I took
pictures."
those pictures.
Right. Exactly. So I believe,
Hmm.
and by the way, and I'll go even further on this. The review board had two witnesses. All right. One of them was a Secret Service. I think they were both Secret Service agents. Okay. And they said that they had seen evidence that Kennedy's brain was really at the AFIP, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which is on the same area that Bethesda is, but it's on the other side. It's a completely different building. All
Hmm.
right. And how they asked him, "Well, how did you know it was Kennedy's brain?" Said, "Because it said right on the vial,
It's
John F.
labeled.
Kennedy." John F. Kennedy.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the mystery of Kennedy's brain is,
Hmm.
I believe, absolutely integral to this case today. You know, um, Gary Aguilar in the film, I asked him this question, why do you think they did that? And he said, well, one possibility is they did not want to reveal all the damage and the massive loss of weight to
In the
Kennedy's.
back, in the
Yes,
back of the head,
right.
because that's
Right.
exactly what that would reveal is that was an exit wound.
Yes. So that's why they probably, they, because, they were all, that's a teaching hospital.
Hmm.
They could have swiped it out very easily,
Sure.
with other specimens. That's the kind of depth of the subterfuge that this case has gone into.
Well,
It's almost
there's so
shocking.
many, it is, and there's so many different stories about that. And the one that we heard the most, pretty much, from the time of the Warren Commission back in the 60s, was that, and Chief Justice Warren, I believe, said that Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, had specifically restricted those specimens from study because he didn't want the ghouls, I guess, people like us who ask questions about what happened. They didn't want us examining the president's brain. Um, what do you think about
Whatever
that?
whatever brain Kennedy buried with his brother is not the real brain.
Hmm,
Okay.
right.
Bobby was not even in the autopsy room that night. Okay. So, and because he was getting his information from Berkeley, from
Mhm.
Admiral George Berkeley.
That's right.
Now, Berkeley, if you recall, and you probably do, in a 1964 interview that he did with the Kennedy Library, they asked him, "What do you think of this, the Warren Commission thing? Where this Oswald guy pulled off two direct hits and three shots in 6 seconds?" And he said, "I'd rather not comment on that." All right. Then he signed the autopsy face sheet, which puts the back wound at what they call T3, which is about 5.5 inches below the neck. And if you can believe this, they erased his signature from the copy in the Warren report. He signed a death certificate. He signed a death certificate which said the same thing. which is about 5 inches below. I've come to the
Incredible.
conclusion. Oh, and here's the best one. For the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he told the first chief counsel, Richard Sprague, who was a brilliant prosecutor,
Mm.
very experienced in homicide cases, very experienced in conspiracies also. He left a message with Richard Sprague saying that he would like to talk to the House Select Committee because he has some information they would probably be very interested in. All right. Well, guess what? He backtracked on that. Okay. And he never did a deposition for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Now, here's the end of the story. When Jeremy Gunn and Doug Horn took over the medical investigation, Jeremy Gunn got in talked because Berkeley was dead by then. He got in contact with Berkeley's daughter and said,
That's right. Yes.
yeah, and
I
said,
remember that.
we would very much like to look at your father's files. Okay, because we're reinvestigating, we're trying to secure all the files on the JFK case. And she initially agreed to do it. And they were, oh, this is great. We'll set it up with the law firm, which is Illig in Erie, PA, my hometown. And they were all set to do it. She reversed field at the last minute.
Mm.
Okay. Now, I believe that George Berkeley knew a lot more than he was ever willing to say about anything. Okay. And when
He
we
had
asked,
to know. He had
yes,
to know.
you know why? Because he was the only doctor who was at Parkland and at Bethesda. He was at both scenes, and he was more or less supervising the autopsy. Okay, at Bethesda, and we know what happened at Bethesda. You know,
Mhm.
they broke almost every rule of what's supposed to be a real autopsy because number one, and most people don't understand how important this is, but it's very important. And I'll explain why in a minute. They never dissected the back wound. What that means
Right.
is you clean out the wound, you get out all the flesh and the blood, etc. All right. So you can put a rod through to see where the bullet entered and exited. They
Mhm.
never did that. All
That's right.
right. They never did that. And we didn't know that till the trial of Clay Shaw,
Mhm.
where Pierre Fink finally testified.
And the way that they explained that in the Warren report, right, as they're
They
telling us
didn't.
this, they really didn't. Yeah. But they tried to convince us that the
That
bullet
there
that
was a
hit him
trajectory.
in the back came out the throat and that the
Really.
throat was an exit wound. Isn't that right?
Now, Lori, I ask you, if a bullet is coming in at a downward angle, okay, from a six-story window, and it enters 5 inches below the collar, how on earth does it exit?
How does it do that? You know? And why, if that was an exit wound, wasn't the front of his throat completely blown open? There would have been a huge wound,
Right.
and yet the
It would have
wound
been
in
an
the
exit
throat
wound.
was
Yes.
the size of your finger, you know?
So then the other thing is they never dissected the headshot. Okay. All right. See, now in this kind, if a guy dies of a gunshot wound to the brain, which is what happened here, okay, you're supposed to what they call section the brain off.
Mhm.
And there's two ways to do it. There's what they call a bread loaf style, you know, like you're slicing a loaf of bread in series. And there's what they call the pie cut, which is you cut it like a pie diagonally. All right. And you do this in order to see the bullet path or paths, you know, through the brain. Now, if you can believe this, and you're going to have to believe it because it's true. In the supplementary autopsy report, James Humes, who was the chief pathologist, said sectioning of the brain was not done in order to preserve the specimen. Now, if you remember what Cyril Weck said about this in
Mhm.
JFK Revisited, preserve the specimen for what? For Jacqueline Kennedy's mantelpiece to put it on a display in a museum? Preserve the brain for what reason? Okay. So,
For examination and analysis, one might think, which
yeah,
would, yeah.
right. When I talked to Henry Lee, I did a pre-interview with Henry Lee for the film. I drove out to Malibu to meet him at this restaurant. And I asked him about this point. I said, if me and Oliver want to do a trajectory analysis, how should we do it? And he said, you can't in the JFK case. And I was kind of surprised by this. I go, you can't? He goes, you can't because neither wound was dissected. If a wound isn't dissected, you can't speak with any authority about the trajectory. It's more or less guesswork. It might be good guesswork, it might be bad guesswork, but you can't do it with any kind of certainty. All right. And so I thought about this. I said, well, this guy's certified to testify in 48 states in America and 42 countries overseas. All right. Then he's probably knows something about what he's talking about. So we decided not to do this in the film. We decided not to do this whole trajectory analysis thing.
Yeah, well,
But
it sounds
I
like it would
really
have been
want
a
to
waste of
hammer
time and money.
I really want to hammer home how important that is to your audience and the incredible reasons for not doing it. In the case of the brain, it's ridiculous to preserve the specimen. All right. And then at the trial of Clay Shaw, which I believe was in February of 69,
Mhm.
Pierre Fink, one of the pathologists, was asked this direct question. And he didn't want to answer. Garrison's assistant DA, Alvin Oser, had to ask this question 8 times. And then he turned to the judge because he was so frustrated. And he said, Your Honor, can you please order the witness to answer the question? And he said they were prevented from doing a dissection of the back wound by certain military brass that was in the room. All right. Now, Oliver Stone caught all kinds of Hades when he
Mm.
put that in his movie.
Yes.
He was attacked by the Journal of American Medical Association twice. But it's right there in the transcript of the trial, all right, that they were stopped from doing a dissection by some of the military brass, all right? And that is, I believe, one of the most
Mm.
incriminating things about this about this whole case.
Indeed. Indeed. And there's so much, but the autopsy, and that's why what the doctors saw is such an important program. And I'm so glad they did it before all of these doctors pass away. We're losing so many key witnesses. And in my mind, Jim, there are probably no better witnesses than those doctors at Parkland Hospital. I think their input, their expertise is far more valuable than that of, say, someone like Mary Moorman or someone in Dealey Plaza that day, because they're not doctors. These
Mhm.
guys actually examined the patient. And to my mind, they're definitely the most important witnesses that we have. I want to play this clip of you on Fox and Friends this week. And I thought it was hilarious, Jim, because Brian Kilmeade butchered your name. He was trying to.
Everybody who saw that show says, Jim, what did they do to your name?
Oh my
And
God.
and I said, what's really strange about this is I pronounced my name right before we went on the air.
And he's
You know,
like, Jim
Today marks 60 years since JFK's assassination, and the public is still looking for answers. Recent revelations from a Secret Service agent on Kennedy's detail calls the magic bullet theory into question. Paul Landis says he found a bullet lodged into the seat of JFK's limo after he was shot. He then grabbed it to thwart souvenir hunters. After that, Landis says he placed the bullet next to Kennedy on the president's stretcher at the hospital. Now, this would contradict the Warren Commission, which said the bullet struck the president from behind and continued on to hit Texas Governor John Connally, begging the question, were there multiple shooters? John DiEugenio is the writer behind Oliver Stone's documentary JFK Revisited and contributed to the brand new book, The JFK Assassination, Chokeholds. He joins us now. First off, Jim, your thoughts about this new revelation, or is it new to you?
Well, if Landis is correct, then, as the intro said, then that creates some very serious problems for the Warren Commission report, because it's very simply it's too many bullets. All right, the Warren Commission says that there were only 3 bullets fired from the 6th floor. This creates an extra bullet, and it strongly indicates that there is a second assassin, which is something that the Warren Commission did not countenance at all, because their magic bullet was found allegedly on Conley's gurney. Landis says he put this bullet, on Kennedy's gurney. So it can't be the same bullet. So this is very, very interesting, and again, like I said, the Warren Commission said four bullets in whatever they wanted it to be, 6 seconds, would strongly indicate that there was a second assassin. So with Landis's revelations, it pretty much contradicts the conclusions in the Warren Commission. I'm just disappointed it took so long for it to come out.
So Jim, from what you studied to put the script together and what you presented as possibilities, do you still believe Oswald was involved?
With this and the new evidence coming out from the film What the Doctor Saw, which is on cable now, I strongly disinclined to believe that Oswald was involved. Yeah.
Eyewitnesses there at the time, and I was looking back at some of the black and white stuff, it's all on YouTube, they were pointing towards what we now famously call the grassy knoll. So people say, well, that was just because of the way the sound bounced off buildings, it threw people off. Did you find that?
Well, if you take a look at the films after the assassination, there's literally scores of people going towards the so-called grassy knoll, which would indicate that there is someone shooting from the front. All right. Now, as far as this whole echo correlation, there really does, that effect really doesn't exist in Dealey Plaza, because it's an open-sided on the other side. All right. It's not completely surrounded by walls, which is what you would need if you wanted an echo kind of thing.
Jim, thanks so much. Appreciate it. We'll continue to pursue this. 60 years later, still so many questions. Even RFK Jr. was on our couch where talking about his uncle's assassination. He's got huge questions, and he obviously is tuned into all of it. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Jim.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.
So Jim, what's his name?
You know something? I didn't realize that he butchered my name. That it's not even close.
Not even close. And he tried 3 times. He still failed. That's
Okay,
great.
wow.
Oh,
And by the way, do you know what time that was? Because they're in New York.
early.
Okay, I was up at 5 o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then they called me in at about 5:20. I just barely had enough time to wash my face, brush my teeth, and slap myself awake. Okay. And then by the way, I completely thought about that. I forgot about that third question. I thought they only asked me 2, but they did ask me 3. Okay.
Yeah, they managed to cover at least some territory in your very brief 4-minute stint. But I have a question, or actually one of our viewers has a question. One of our Canadian viewers in Ontario, Divine Intervention, asks for you, why isn't the whole Kennedy clan united about these investigations? I think that's a great question. We've been asking it now for 60 years. Care to explain? Can you explain?
Well, okay. There was, in David Talbot's book, I think, Brothers. Okay. I passed on this witness to David, which he utilized. And this was a friend of Peter Lawford before he passed on. All right. And he had told this guy that after the assassination, there was a meeting, I believe it was up in Hyannisport, all right, which Bobby Kennedy led this meeting. And Bobby Kennedy, I'm sure everybody who's listening to your show knows, and you yourself know, he suspected a conspiracy literally day
Mhm.
one.
Yeah.
Okay. All
First
right.
hour, he was on the phone with the
Yes.
CIA
Right.
immediately.
Right. He's asking him, did one of you guys have something to do with this horror? Okay. And
Right.
so he conducted a meeting and he said, do we want to pursue this thing? All right. The guy who objected was Ted Kennedy.
Yes.
All right. He did not think it was wise to pursue this thing. And I guess, see, because Ted Kennedy understood that this would immolate his career politically because the media was so strong on this Oswald did it thing. All right. And so he
Well, there's
argued,
something else, if I could interject. In the
sure,
summer,
it's your
you know,
show.
well, I just wanted to put this out there because a lot of people don't know this, but in the summer of 1964, before the Warren Report even came out, Ted Kennedy was involved in a plane crash off Martha's Vineyard, and he was nearly paralyzed. He
Didn't
was
he
in
like
a
break his back or
he
something?
did, he did. I mean, he was in traction for over a year, and everyone else on board the plane perished. A lot of people think that might have been a message to Senator Kennedy.
I wouldn't be surprised. See, because Bobby Kennedy, um, again, you probably know this story, but maybe some of your listeners don't. On, I think, November 28th or 29th, William Walton, who was a cultural ambassador to the Soviet Union at that time, was supposed to go to Moscow. And Bobby Kennedy delayed the trip and said, I want you to come to my house before you leave. I want to talk to you. All right. So Walton showed up at Hickory Hill and he was shown into the dining room where Bobby Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy were sitting waiting for him. And they both gave him letters. All right. Bobby Kennedy's letter said words of the effect, and again, this is not verbatim, okay, but this is the gist of it. Okay. We know that everybody's blaming this Oswald guy, and we know that this is not true. This is the result of a large domestic conspiracy. As a result, because Lyndon Johnson is so beholden to big business, you will not be able to pursue the detente that my brother was seeking with you. All right. But I will soon resign the Attorney General office. Okay. And I will then run for the presidency. And at that time, we can take up where my brother and you left off.
Hmm.
So now, do you know where that? This
Mm.
is what's so surprising about this. Do you know where that letter was found? It was found in the Kremlin. Nobody ever found it in the United States. Okay, when Tim Naftali was doing his book about the missile crisis, all right, one hell of
Mhm.
a gamble. He communicated with this Russian general, all right, and he had the letter, all right, okay. So, in other words,
Well, there's probably another copy that we can't get our hands on yet.
well, that might be true.
The
Yeah,
Robert Kennedy papers, as long as Ethel is living, his widow, a lot of those papers at the Kennedy Library are still sealed to the
you mean
public.
the Bobby Kennedy's papers?
Yes.
Yeah, the
Mhm.
JFK papers are pretty much out there, but
Yeah,
if,
yeah.
it
I'm talking
might
about
be
Bobby's papers,
it might be there.
Bobby's
Yes,
letters,
right.
right?
All right. So, in other words, see, Bobby Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, by the way, you know, Jackie Kennedy didn't even want to see JFK. Oliver asked me once, he said, well, if Jackie Kennedy knew about this, you know, then why didn't she stand up for me? I said words of the effect. In my opinion, Jackie Kennedy had PTSD.
Mm.
as a result of this case. Carly Simon was living in that famous building in New York, the Dakotas,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which is this $1 million kind
It's
of
where John
apartment.
Lennon lived
Yeah,
and was
that's where he
killed.
was killed, right,
Right.
exactly. All right, and that's where they filmed Rosemary's Baby,
That's
all
right.
right? And, Lauren Bacall lived there. She bought her apartment for something like 35,000. She sold it for 12 million. All right, that's the kind of place this is. And so they lived in this building. And Carly Simon was friends with Jackie Kennedy. And JFK had opened, all right? And she asked her, "Well, let's go see this movie about your husband."
Oh
And
God, no.
she wouldn't go.
No. No,
She
no, no,
wouldn't
no, no, no,
go.
no, no, no.
It would be
Yeah,
like living a nightmare all over. Well,
exactly.
imagine if you're her and you have to watch this nightmare scenario of your husband's brains being blown out in front of you every time they run the Zapruder film. And in
That's
that
right.
movie, they ran it like 4 times,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And
So
and very dramatic recreation of events that would have been terrible. I totally understand why Jackie Kennedy
yeah.
would not and should not see a film like JFK. But her son, John
Hmm.
Jr., today is his birthday.
Oh, I didn't
Ha-
know that.
Yeah, had he lived, he'd be 63 years old today. And probably a very sexy 63, I'll just add. But I actually knew John, it's a long story, and I've told it here on Maverick News before. But I've known a few members of the Kennedy family over the years, and I asked that same question that our viewer in Ontario asked. I said, why isn't the Kennedy family interested in this sort of thing, in finding out the truth about what happened to Bobby and to Jack? And I was told, and this was 30 years ago, back in the day, that as long as Teddy was alive, it was his wish that we stay quiet about it. And Caroline Kennedy has never, ever addressed a word of conspiracy talk about her father. And JFK Jr., when the JFK Oliver Stone film came out in 1991, a reporter did ask him if he'd seen it. And he said no. He said he didn't want to.
Well, there's a very interesting thing that I don't know you probably have told your listeners about, which I did not know. All right. When JFK Jr. was publishing George, all right, and the assassination of Rabin
Mm-hmm.
took place,
Mm-hmm.
you told me that this was one of the very, very few times that he took an editorial hand in what was going into the magazine. And he actually took control of that story, which was a long story, by the way.
Yes.
It was like 11 pages.
And a good one. Good
Yes,
investigative work.
yeah. And he got in contact with the accused assassin's mother and
Mm-hmm.
let her have her say. Okay. And I think you insinuated to me, and to be perfectly frank, I didn't believe it before I read the story. After I read the story, you know, I thought that what you said made sense. This was his way of expressing his deeper thoughts about what happened to JFK. And if you read this story, which is it was a really remarkable piece of journalism,
It is.
then I think there is some validity to that,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. And he also did I remember there was a conspiracies issue of George. I think it was the only time in the pages of George, and he interviewed Oliver Stone to talk about JFK, the
I didn't
JFK
know that
conspiracy.
either.
That's a classic issue you should look up. But issues of George are very expensive now.
Oh, really? I
If
didn't
you
know
can
that.
find them on eBay, because all of the QAnon people who think that JFK Jr. is still alive,
Oh,
they get into
oh.
bidding wars on eBay for those old issues of George. And so I wish I would have kept my collection, because I was a subscriber to George. I had every issue and I saved them for years after John died, because, like I said, he was a friend of mine and I loved George and I missed him. And it was just a way of kind of keeping a piece of him close, keep those memories close. But I eventually gave in and I sold my collection, because
Oh, you did?
they're fetching such great prices right now. So to find, and it's unfortunate that no one has really gone to the trouble to scan those pages or articles and post
They're
them
not
online.
online?
There's not a George archive on the internet, and there should be,
Wow.
but you'll find this interesting. There's a guy, his name is, oh, I can't think of it. It's George Ho or something like that. He was a staff photographer on the Donald Trump campaign in 2016, and he's just filthy rich apparently. So he's revived George magazine, and he brought it back just a few months ago. They did their debut issue with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the cover, and they did this big interview with Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Wow, I didn't know that either.
So George magazine is back again apparently, and it's really beautifully done. It's just like George was. It's full color, glossy pages, really nice looking magazine. And I'm
Thanks
sure
for that information.
those are going to be collector's items someday. So
Yeah.
get you some.
Yeah.
Speaking of Bobby Kennedy Jr. and the assassination, presidential candidate like his dad, he's going for it again. And like his father, Bobby goes, to his credit, much further than any member of the Kennedy family has ever gone
on either case.
On both cases. That's right.
On
both
either
cases.
case, yeah. See,
And
the thing
so,
about
go ahead.
thing which is I actually said this in Pittsburgh because I was discussing JFK's foreign policy in my speech, and I tried to bring up a little known aspect of his foreign policy, which was the Middle East, and I brought up about his relationship with Gamal Abdel Nasser, which hardly anybody ever talks about at all. Okay,
President of Egypt, for those of you who aren't familiar with Nasser.
But the thing is, Nasser was one of the most charismatic leaders of that whole area.
Yeah, he was like the JFK of the Middle East back then.
Yeah, right. There's never been anybody since, and you'd have to go back centuries before to find somebody that dominant. He was that appealing. All right. And so somebody then asked me about Bobby Kennedy. And I said, you know something? After studying this, the Bobby Kennedy of 1968 was a very different guy from the Bobby Kennedy of 1963.
So true.
Okay. And I think that he went through a transformation. And I believe the Bobby Kennedy of 1968 made his brother look like a moderate. Okay.
He did.
He was that far out there. Just give you one story. When Bobby Kennedy made a Latin American tour in 1965. They went to various countries down there. All right. And when they were in Brazil, he had met with the president, and then he had gone into a motorcade to be taken back to his hotel. He looked out the side of the car and saw some policemen beating back the crowd. Okay. Which he didn't like.
That's
okay.
right.
All right. He jumped out of the car, landed on his feet, and spoke to the crowd and said, "Down with the government, on to the palace." Okay. Now, can you believe that?
That does not sound like the Law and Order Bobby Kennedy of the 1950s. And
now, can you believe that an attorney general would say that down there?
Right.
And the writer of this book, The Revolution of Bobby Kennedy, I think his name was Bohr. Okay. Bohrer. Okay. And he said that Bobby did so many radical things down there that they didn't even report him in the American press. Okay. Another one was, I think it was, I'm not really sure about this, but it was either Chile or Uruguay or something like that. And they were complaining about the Rockefeller influence, okay, down there. And Bobby Kennedy said words to the effect, well, why don't you nationalize the oil companies? All right. And so they said, if we did that, David Rockefeller would have the Navy fleet down here the next day. And Bobby said, the Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast.
Ha!
Then somebody asked him about that because that actually got reported. And he said, and you know what he said? He said, I meant oysters, Rockefeller.
I love that. Great story.
Yeah, that's terrific.
But even in his time, even though he had evolved, Bobby Kennedy himself did have a stake in the Warren Commission fiction. We have to be honest here and say that throughout his presidential campaign, he would not pledge to reopen the case. He never disavowed the Warren Commission. He said that they got it right until right before his death, right? And we know that he, at a speech, I forget which college it was. Do you recall?
I think it was in the San Fernando Valley. I don't know
Yeah, it was
what
in
college.
California
Yeah.
somewhere. And he said that he would, reluctantly, he said, okay, I'll take a look at it, because he was being harassed by college students of that generation who wanted answers.
Right.
And so now his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., running for president as an independent, um, has gone further than any member of the Kennedy family,
By the way, you
further
know
than
how
his
that
dad.
happened? Do you know how that happened?
Well, I played some part in it, but tell me.
Now, this is how that happened. See, Bobby Jr. wasn't really part of that until a guy named Paul Schrade.
That's right.
Paul Schrade was a victim
Yeah.
at the Ambassador that night. It's a miracle he survived.
Yes.
But he was very good friends with Bobby.
You know
Both.
how they met?
No, I don't.
I gave Bobby Paul's phone number.
He what?
Me.
Oh, you gave him his number?
That's a true story. Paul approached, at the time, he was approaching several members of the RFK family, and he was trying to get them to look at the evidence, to listen to the Presidency recording, to look at the autopsy. And he contacted me. He reached out to me, and he was like, "Can you get this stuff to Bobby?" And he started sending me, because you can't tell Paul Schrade no. Paul Schrade never took no for an answer. And I told him, I said, "Paul, I don't think that Bobby's going to be very receptive to this," because this was 2008. Ted Kennedy was still alive, although he was just diagnosed with the cancer that would claim his life. But as long as he was alive, the deal was you just didn't talk about this. And Bobby was not interested, to be honest with you, in looking at anything pertaining to his father's death. He believed, as pretty much all of the RFKs believe, that Sirhan killed their dad. And that's what they'd been raised to believe. He was not interested in looking at any conspiracy stuff. And so I tried to warn Paul. I said, this is not going to be easy. But I started forwarding packages to Bobby that Paul sent to me. And I would say, look, would you please take a look at this? Because Paul was in his 80s. I said, this man is devoted, he devoted a big portion of his life to your dad. They were very good friends. He was shot that night, took a bullet right in his forehead.
Yes.
Lucky to be alive. He made a full recovery, and he spent the next 40 years of his life trying to get down to the bottom of what happened that night at the Ambassador. And I said, the least you could do is have lunch with him next time you're in LA. At that time, Bobby was living in New York. So Paul was across the country, but on a couple of Bobby's trips to LA, I kept slipping in Paul's phone number, because I kept pestering him about it. I said, you're a good lawyer, and I know that this is your dad, and I know it's emotional, but as a lawyer who believes in justice and truth, I think you owe it to yourself to take a look at this evidence and try to distance yourself from it and look at it as an attorney would, as a prosecutor would, as a defense attorney might. And eventually, yeah, he did call Paul Schrade, but it took Jim at least 3 years, maybe 4 years, for him to get around to picking up the phone and actually meeting Paul. And then once they did, they became like the best of friends.
Right.
And
See,
Paul convinced him.
The thing is, the RFK case doesn't get anywhere near the amount of attention the JFK case does, for a lot of complicated reasons. But the RFK case, I believe, is easier to prove a conspiracy than the JFK case is.
Mhm.
because nobody knows anything about it, and they think it's an open and shut case. But once you explain the circumstances, it takes maybe 35 or 40 seconds for them to understand why it was impossible for Sirhan to actually be the killer of RFK. And I do this demonstration often. I did it up in Quebec when me and Oliver were up there. I had a guy stand in front of me and I say,
Mhm.
okay, I'm Sirhan. I'm 5'4.5". This is Bobby Kennedy. He's 5'10.5". All right. So here I am shooting this handgun at Bobby Kennedy. So where do you think all the bullets are going to hit? And they inevitably say, well, the neck and shoulder area. And then I turn to the audience and say, not one bullet hit Bobby Kennedy in that area. And I go around to the opposite side of the guy, and I say every bullet that came into RFK came in from behind at an extreme upward angle, and the fatal bullet was at what they call a point contact range, which means the muzzle of the gun was almost right up against Kennedy's skull. Now, how on earth
Mhm.
could Sirhan have delivered those bullets into Kennedy's body? And
Physically
just like that,
impossible.
yeah, right, right,
Yeah.
okay. And so this is why I think it's easier to prove that the RFK case is a conspiracy than the JFK case.
Mm.
The JFK case might take you a couple minutes, okay, but the RFK case will take you about 40
A
seconds.
couple of minutes. It's been
Yeah.
like 40 years for me and probably 50 for you. And we're still learning new things. But, as a campaign pledge, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has pledged that on day one of his administration, he will declassify and release every single file that the government is still hiding in those JFK files. And as president, he would have the power to do that.
Well, let's
But
talk about that for a minute, because that
yeah, let's
we have
do.
a guy in this book, the JFK assassination chokeholds, Andrew Eiler, who's a very accomplished attorney from your best buddy's country, Canada. I think he's up there in Hamilton.
Mm.
Okay. And he is a very good litigator. And so he wrote part of the book about this very fact, you know, how Trump and Biden had both disregarded the letter of the law.
Mhm.
Okay. Because I'm sure you talked about this before, but everything was supposed to be out by 2017,
Right.
October of 2017.
On
And,
Trump's watch.
and Trump actually tweeted about this.
Mhm.
He said, I'm really looking forward to releasing the last of the JFK files. So what happens to Mr. Outsider? Mr. I'm going to shake up the swamp. The FBI and the CIA go in to see
Yeah.
him
The
on the
swamp paid
day.
him a visit. A little visit.
and suddenly Trump saw the light.
Mm.
Well, we're going to delay this for 6 months. So he delayed it for 6 months. Then he topped that and said, I'm going to delay it now for 3 years. Now, what's so odd about that is that's beyond the election. That's
Yeah.
beyond it might not even be him in office, which it
Oh, but
wasn't.
Trump. He thought he was going to be in office.
Right. Or he might have thought that.
He thought
Right.
he won the election too.
See, then what happens? And again, I'm not playing any favorites here. I believe what Biden did was in some ways even worse than what Trump did.
Mhm.
Because what Biden did, and Andrew has a very good article on this at kennedysandking.com, which I really recommend everybody read. It, he literally eviscerated the JFK Act, you know, and I'm not kidding. He set up a whole different body where the CIA and the FBI could now go in and plead their case
Yep.
to these people to keep it. Now, why is that so different? Because let me tell you why. John Tunheim was the chairman of the ARB. He's still alive. He's a judge in Minnesota. If you take a look at JFK Revisited, we interviewed him. He said that at their first meeting with the CIA, they put a document on the screen. And they said, look, we don't see any reason to keep this classified. All right. Unless you give us a very good reason, we're going to release this document. Okay. And the CIA guy says, well, Give me a couple minutes.
Give me a
I'll
minute. I'll think of something.
And I'll think of something.
Literally.
Now, when the FBI came in, that guy came in with an attorney. All right. And Tonheim gave him the same speech. Yeah, look, we're going to declassify this thing, whether you like it or not. We don't see any reason to keep this classified. The FBI guy turns to the lawyer and says, "Can they really do that?" The lawyer says, "Yeah, they can." See, that was the difference between what was going on back then. That's why we got 2 million pages declassified.
Exactly.
Versus what is happening now. All right. And it's a bloody shame because there is so much great stuff. And a lot of it is in this book. Some of it is in the movie JFK Revisited, you know, that we managed to get out of those archives that was never supposed to see the light of day. You know, and in
at least not until many, many years in the future. I mean, you sped up that they weren't supposed to be released until at least, I think, 2039.
2029.
I thought it was 2039.
Well, you might be right. Okay, who cares about the one?
Or at least that's that was the case with the LBJ papers. I don't know if that was true of the JFK papers, but you know, it sped up that to happen within our lifetimes so that we could know what we do know now. And basically where President Biden left it when it became his turn once again to confront the JFK files, he basically invalidated the JFK Records Act, did he not?
That's exactly. I would, you know, that is not an extreme statement at all. Okay.
He just said, well, the law's expired, and so therefore I don't have to follow it. And I'm the president. What are you going to do?
But wait a minute, Lori, if you remember, Biden was a senator when the JFK Act passed.
He voted for it.
He voted for the JFK Act.
He did.
Now he's punting. You know, he voted for it, and now he's reversed field. You know, this is so crazy. You know, what is there possibly to hide 60 years after Kennedy's assassination?
Well, as a matter of fact, Jim, that brings us right back to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is trying to take Biden's job. He's running against him. And on November 22nd, RFK Jr. put out a video that I want to show you. It's a brief video where he launched a petition drive to all of America to sign, asking President Biden to finally declassify and release the JFK files in accordance with the law. And if you hadn't seen this, I think you'll be happy to hear that.
On November 22nd, 1963, my uncle, President John F. Kennedy, was murdered in broad daylight in Dallas. For 60 years, the United States government has covered up the truth about that assassination, which is one of the reasons that it has lost the public trust. Was it a lone gunman, as the Warren Commission concluded in 1964? Or was there a larger conspiracy, as the House Select Committee on Assassination concluded after reviewing a much larger body of evidence in 1979? I have my own thoughts on that subject, but one thing is for sure: the antidote to conspiracy is transparency. In 1992, Congress mandated the release of all records related to the John F. Kennedy assassination by 2017. Well, that date has come and gone. President Trump refused to release thousands of pages of documents, and so did President Biden. No one seriously believes that any national security secrets are at stake 60 years later. What is so embarrassing that they want to hide? I don't know what those documents will show, but I do believe in transparency, which is the only way to restore trust in our government, the trust that began to erode in 1963. And that's why we're circulating a petition to ask President Biden to keep his promise by releasing all JFK assassination documents as required by the law. I'm asking you to share this video and sign the petition, and then I'll send it to President Biden to give him a chance to level with the American people.
You know, I hate to say this, I didn't see that. Why don't you email it to me?
Sure.
Okay. And I'll put it up at our website.
Oh, yes, please.
That's really the way to go. That's
Wasn't
really
that
good.
great?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm so
that's
happy to
really.
see that.
I mean, when have we ever had a guy who would be that out in the open about this issue? I mean, if you remember, the only other guy I can think of who said something like this was Al Gore back when he was running for vice president, which I believe was in 92.
92? Yeah.
Yeah, they asked because this was after
Yeah.
JFK came
Mm.
out. And so they
Mhm.
asked Clinton and Gore on the campaign trail. And Clinton did his usual sitting on
Dance.
the fence, maybe, maybe not. But
Oh, but just like Joe Biden, Bill Clinton claimed to be such a big fan of JFK, right? He met
that's
JFK as a
actually
teenager.
true. That's
Yeah,
true.
he did.
And Gore said, I believe that it was a conspiracy. Now I don't know if you've heard this story. I know why Al Gore thought that way. When Gore was a congressman from Tennessee, he knew a guy named Bud Fensterwald who was stationed in Washington and at that time ran the Assassinations Archive and Research Center. And so he approached Gore when he first got there and said, look, can I make a little arrangement with you? Before you fly back to Tennessee on Friday, can you please come into my office for like maybe an hour or so? You know, and I'll have these documents laid out for you. And I want you to read them. It's about the Kennedy assassination. And I don't think you've seen this stuff. And
Really?
so
Huh.
Gore agreed to do it. And he did it for a year. Okay, every Friday before he'd fly back to Tennessee, he would go to Bud's office and read this stuff. And at the
Wow.
end of the year, he called Bud over and he said, Bud, you're right, it was a conspiracy. Okay. So
Now,
that's how he said what he said in 92.
I never knew that
Now,
story.
isn't
That
that a
is so
great
interesting.
story?
Well, there's a family tie there too with the Bouvier side of the family and the Gores. As you know, Gore Vidal was,
Uh-huh.
I think, a cousin of Jackie Kennedy. Yeah, it's all in the family. Uh,
So
but I
so
thought, speaking of family, I thought you'd like that. And I was going to add one more thing. As president, a lot of people ask me because I'm a volunteer on the Kennedy 24 campaign, and I get asked a lot about the JFK files and what's Bobby going to do. And he has pledged to release everything that he can on day one, like everything
mhm.
that's still existing. But it's unfortunate he cannot do that in the case of his own father because that's a state crime that Sirhan was charged with, and he has no power over a state prosecution. He can't
Well, wait a
pardon
minute.
Sirhan.
What he can do, if it was possible to do this, but I'm not sure it's possible to do it, he could release the executive intelligence files on that. In other words, with the FBI. But I'm pretty sure
Hmm.
he would need a piece of enabling legislation to do that, like the JFK Records Act.
Hmm.
Whether there is the will in Congress to do something like that today,
I
that
wonder.
that's an open question.
Interesting.
Okay,
Yeah, I
but
hadn't thought of it that way.
you're right. Since that was a state crime in California, and Bobby was not president at the time, a lot of the documents would be located in places like the LAPD
Yep.
and the state archives up in
And
South.
that's what Paul Schrade spent a lifetime trying to do. He was trying to get the Los Angeles district attorney to reopen the case. That's everything that Paul advocated for day after day after day until he breathed his last. Paul passed away a year
Yes,
ago this week at the
yes.
ripe old age of 97.
He was that old? Wow.
He made it. He made it to 97 and such a spry and healthy 97 too.
I
But
saw him about a few years. He looked good, for about 5 years before he died. He looked good for that age, and he was getting
yep,
around. You know,
yep. He walked with a cane, but he
hmm
got around just fine. There's an
and he would go to every public event on the RFK case and have something to say about it. You know,
It was his
what
driving passion, and so I wish that Bobby could do more as president.
what a good
Unfortunately,
guy!
there
What a
isn't
good
much he
guy!
can do.
If you don't know who
Mm.
Paul Schrade was a union activist at this time in 1968. And one of the most interesting things he ever told me was that about the organization of the fruit workers in Delano. Okay. And this is something I didn't know at the time when he told me about it. He said, Jim, it was Cesar Chavez who got Bobby Kennedy out to Delano. I said, what? And he goes, yeah, it was his idea. And he got the information into Bobby's office.
That's right.
And that's how he ended up there.
True
Now,
story.
if you don't know the great part of this story, you really should. But I'm sure Lori has told her audience about this before. If you haven't seen this film, you really have to see it. It's on film. There's these tables in the front of the room, okay, and Bobby's one of the senators there, and there's the witnesses testifying about the conditions in Delano, and
Mm,
the chief of police
I love that.
this witness chair, and Bobby asked him, "Why did you disperse the demonstration?" And he said words of the effect, "Well, we had information that it was going to end up, in a kind of violent way."
That it might.
Yeah,
It might.
yeah. And
Cool.
so Bobby said, "So in other words, you dispersed the demonstrators before they did anything wrong?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And then Bobby says, I think we should call a break and somebody give this guy the Constitution of the United States so he'll know the law a little better next
You
time.
can read the First Amendment. Just take some time and familiarize yourself with the First Amendment during the break.
If you haven't seen it, you got to
love
see
it.
it. It's on YouTube.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And there's like a whole episode of that series, right? Where Paul Schrade is the star, I think, of the final episode. He really gets a chance to make his case. And he made such a persuasive case to get justice for Bobby Kennedy. And, even though he was no fan of Sirhan, he believed till the day he died that Sirhan's bullet hit him. So
Yes.
he found it within him, though, to forgive Sirhan because he believed that Sirhan was in fact mind controlled,
Yes,
was
right.
not in control of his faculties,
That's
and
that's the key to
never
that
meant
case.
to hurt him, and he forgave Sirhan, which was
Why was
huge.
that girl wearing that dress that night?
Mm.
That is so interesting. I've
The
always
girl
found
in the
that.
polka dot
Yeah.
dress, the
Why would you
mysterious
wear a
girl.
dress like that
Yeah.
if you're standing right next to the assumed assassin and
Mm.
everybody can see you? Why would you wear that dress?
That's the kind of dress you wear to get attention, and
Right, exactly.
recently I was talking to you and your friend Lisa Pease about that, and she said there were 2 girls in polka dot dresses there that night.
That's true. That's true.
Interesting.
But the other girl did not have it was a green and yellow dress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
hers was either a navy blue or a black against a white background. Okay.
Right.
See, not enough people know that much about the facts, of the RFK case.
Mm.
And that's really a shame.
Yeah, does
Because,
Oliver Stone need to make a film about it so people will care?
I don't
I wish
think
he would.
Oliver would be eager to do another thing like that since he
Yeah.
got blasted off the landscape, the first time around.
Right. But what does he have to lose now? He's already lost it all, right? So
Well, whatever he has now, he would probably lose. Okay, at least he's now able to make $35 million movies. Not
Yeah.
as expensive as they used to be, but
Still
and
great films, though.
and only 2 hours. Well, remember JFK was 3 hours and 15 minutes long,
Yeah, it was an
and back
epic.
in 1991, it cost 40 million.
Yeah.
And by the way, that film, they're doing a 4K of it finally. Okay, and
Oh, cool.
this is why I believe Shout Factory, which is a big DVD sale company, they didn't even want to bring out JFK Revisited on DVD. They didn't think it would do that well. Well, guess what? Like I said, on the anniversary, it was number 4 after a year. Okay. So it did do that well. And so then they got the idea now of doing a recast, transfer of 1991's JFK. Okay, so that's coming out very soon, in a very high definition version. So that's I don't know how many of you if you have a young audience or what, but what happened in 1991 when he brought out that film was unprecedented in the history of cinema. I've never seen anything like it. Where have you
Me
ever
neither.
seen a film getting attacked 7 months before it was released? And by
Literally.
the way, I'm not exaggerating at all. In the Chicago Tribune by a guy named John Margolis, he started the rush to judgment on the movie JFK 7 months before it was released. All right, then
Hmm.
George Lardner
And
picked it up
George
in the
Lardner in the
right,
Post was
yeah,
attacking
in
it.
the
Yeah.
Washington Post, picked it up about a month later, and from there on in, it was open season on Oliver Stone and his movie. The
Yep.
A couple of weeks before it was actually released, which I think was December the 15th, the New York Times,
Yep.
because I know a guy who lived in New York at the time. The New York Times published 30 stories about either the film or the JFK assassination in something like 2 or 3 weeks. And this, of course,
Trying to debunk it, trying to
right,
debunk
a
everything
movie
that,
they
that
never even
Oliver said.
seen.
Right.
All right. This was, I believe, clearly the reasoning behind this was that they wanted to discredit the movie before the audience had a chance to see it because they were
Yep.
afraid of the impact it would have if it got to them unfiltered. Okay.
They were
And
poisoning the waters. And
right.
yes, look at the impact the film did have. It's the only movie that I know of in the history of cinema that actually resulted in a law being
In an act of
passed by the
Congress. Right.
Congress. An
Yeah.
act of Congress came from that film. That's remarkable.
Hmm. And the great thing about the JFK Act, because see, the usual way that people went about getting something out of the archives was what they call a Freedom of Information Act. Okay. Now, the problem with the Freedom of Information Act is very simple. The plaintiff or the person bringing the lawsuit has to show, sight unseen, why a certain document would
Hmm.
benefit the public to the possible detriment of, say, the FBI or the State Department or the CIA. The
Right.
problem
That's the
being,
whole problem with FOIA is sometimes
right,
we don't know what documents they have.
right,
So it's an
exactly,
impossible standard for the researcher to have to meet.
right.
But that is the standard.
In
I've
other
I've
words,
gone through that process many times.
the plaintiff had to bear the burden of proof. Okay.
Yep.
Well, what happened with the JFK Act was, like I said earlier, now the defendant, whoever it was, the State Department, FBI, CIA, whatever, they had to bear the burden of proof. They had to prove why it should not be declassified. And this is why we got all this great stuff, which I don't believe, you agree with me, we probably wouldn't have gotten until many, many, many years down the line. Just let me give you a couple of examples. One of the things that we got as a result of the ARB was a record of the May 1963 SecDef conference in Hawaii. There had been all this debate about, well, Oliver Stone doesn't know what he's talking about with this JFK withdrawal plan from Vietnam. There was no big change of policy or anything like that. It would have been this. Okay. Once this got declassified, because what it showed was that McNamara had asked for withdrawal schedules from every segment of the contingent in Vietnam. That is the CIA, that is the Pentagon, that is the State Department, etc. These were handed in at this SecDef conference. And McNamara looked at them for a couple of minutes and he looked up and said, "This isn't fast enough. We're getting out of here faster." Okay. And it's right there in black and white. Now, do you know how potent those documents were? and you're probably not going to believe me, but I'm telling you the truth. The New York Times wrote an article, headlined something like Kennedy had exit plan to get out of Vietnam in 1963.
As a matter of fact, that's our thumbnail photo for tonight's show. I used that front page of the
Oh, you did?
newspaper. Yeah, JFK says U.S. troops out of Viet by 65 is the headline.
Right. So
Yeah.
this withdrawal plan was now something that nobody could deny because it was in process as Kennedy was being killed. All right. So this is an incredible piece of evidence that I'm really so glad that the ARB existed. Now, let me tell you something else. There was a woman named Betsy Wolfe who worked for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. She was the analyst of the Oswald file at CIA. She asked for every charter of every division in the CIA to read. I think there were 9 of them at that time. So she got through all these charters, read them all. Then she drew up an imaginary graph. All right, then this is what Oswald's file should have done once it came to the CIA. So then she got the file. And she was shocked. It didn't do anything like that. So then she had to triumph because it was supposed to go what they call the SR division, Soviet Russia. Didn't go there. It went to the Office of Security. Now, not only was that the wrong place for that to go, but the Office of Security does not set up what they call a 201 file, okay, which is the most common file in the whole agency that anybody can walk into that room and find out what they had on Oswald. There was no 201 file set up for 13 months. So she started interviewing people. And in 1978, I believe in September of 1978, she had her eureka moment. She interviewed a guy named Robert Gambino, who at that time was the chief of the Office of Security. She presented her problem to this guy. And he said, look, it doesn't matter how many documents come in. And it doesn't matter if they're pre-stamped. He said, if the client has gone to the first gate, which is the Office of Mail Logistics, and said that he wants those documents sent to him, then they will only go to him and no one else. In other words, and this is really stunning when you think of it. Oswald's file was being rigged on his way to Russia. Okay, how could something like that possibly happen to this kid, this nobody? Okay, but that's how important he was to the CIA at that time. Now, here's the capper. The only reason I knew about this was because a guy named Malcolm Blunt, probably the best archival researcher there is, who lives in England, sent this stuff to me. This was not declassified till 2001. And here's the punchline. Betsy Wolfe's notes were never transcribed into a memorandum form. They're all handwritten. And thank God she had good penmanship. Okay. Can you believe this? So in other words, this never got into the files of the House Select Committee, and it never got into the House Select Committee volumes. I believe it's one of the most important things we've ever learned about Oswald.
You mean sort of like how Senator Richard Russell's dissent was not taken down by the stenographer and was not transcribed and was not included in the Warren Commission volumes?
Do your listeners know about that?
Can you give them the short version of the story? Okay, I'm going to play
let me give you the transistor radio version. Okay.
It's a good story.
Fascinating. When Russell came in to the last meeting of the Warren Commission, him and Hale Boggs and John Cooper wanted to record a dissent that they wanted to go into the volumes. Russell said there was a woman there who was scribbling on a notepad who he thought was a stenographer. And he thought this would get in through her. All right. About 4 or 5 years later, Harold Weisberg approaches him and says, Mr. Russell, have you ever looked at the transcript of that last meeting? And he said,
And he
no.
had not.
Right.
Yeah.
And Weisberg said, do you know it's only 3 pages long? And Russell is shocked. Okay.
Mm.
He says, what do you mean it's only 3 pages long? He goes, that's all there is. There is no, for all intents and purposes, there's no transcript of that last meeting. And Russell went beside himself. He sent over an assistant to the archives and he confirmed that that was the case. This is how treacherous these guys were, how
That's
they
right.
wanted to muffle any dissent from the official story.
That's right. And as a matter of fact, I have a tape right here, which I know you're quite familiar with. This comes from the LBJ library. These are the secret White House recordings of Lyndon Johnson. This tape is from September 18th, 1964. LBJ and Senator Russell were very close friends. They had dinner together every Wednesday night for decades. LBJ said when he forced Senator Russell quite reluctantly to serve on the Warren Commission, a little backstory, Senator Russell couldn't stand Earl Warren, and he did not want to serve on the commission with Earl Warren, and he didn't want anything to do with this. But LBJ forced him to serve on the Warren Commission because he wanted his man, one man that he knew he could trust, his good buddy, Senator Russell, to keep him appraised of what was going on inside that Warren
Lori,
Commission.
do you know what LBJ did? He announced it before Russell said yes.
Yes, he did. Because he knew he would not go along with it
Right,
any other way. I
exactly.
mean, he just forced him into it. And so this is about 10 days before the Warren Commission report was released. And Senator Russell discusses what you were just saying here. He calls Lyndon Johnson at the White House. He's mad as hell here. And he's very upset about how this Warren Commission thing is unfolding and how they treated him being the dissenting voice. Check this out.
So I got out. No, that dang Warren Commission business whooped me down. So we got through today, and I just, you know what I did? I went over and got on the plane and came home. I didn't even have a toothbrush. I didn't bring a shirt. I got a few little things here. I didn't even have my pills, antihistamine pills, to take care of me if I seen them.
Why did you get in such a rush?
Well, I've just worn out fighting over that damn report.
Well, you ought to take another hour and go and get your clothes.
No. Well, they were trying to prove that the same bullet that hit Kennedy first was the one that hit Connolly. Went through him and through his hand, his bone, into his leg, and everything else. Just a lot of stuff there. I couldn't get all the evidence and cross-examine all of them. But I did read the record, and so I don't know. I was the only fellow there that practically that suggested any change, whatever, and what the staff had got up. This staff business always scares me. I like to put my own views down. But we got you a pretty good report.
Well, what difference did it make which bullet got Connolly?
Well, it don't make much difference. But they said that they believe that the commission believes that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connolly. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
I don't either, he said.
I said that Governor Connolly testified directly to the contrary, and I'm not going to approve of that. So I finally made them say there was a difference in the commission in that. Part of them believed that wasn't so. And, of course, if a fellow was accurate enough to hit Kennedy right in the neck on one shot and knock his head off the next one when he was leaning up against his wife's head, not even wound up. Well, he didn't miss completely with that third shot. According to their theory, he not only missed the whole automobile, but he missed the street. Well, the man was a good enough shot to put 2 bullets right into Kennedy. He didn't miss that whole automobile nor the street. But anyhow, that's just a little thing.
What's the meat of the whole thing? What does it say? Oswald did it, and he did it for any reason?
Well, just that he was a general misanthropic fellow, that he had never been satisfied anywhere he was on Earth, in Russia or here, and that he had a desire to get his name in history and all. I don't think you'll be displeased with reports too long.
Just wanted to get his name in the history books, he said, of Lee Harvey Oswald. But Senator Richard Russell, he wasn't buying the single bullet theory, as you just heard there. John Connally, who was riding in the car with Kennedy and who was wounded, he never believed the single bullet theory either. And as it turns out, and we didn't really find out until we got the LBJ tapes 30 years later in the 1990s, that Lyndon Johnson himself didn't believe his own Warren Commission. He thought the single bullet theory was stupid. I mean, he was a hunter. He knew guns really, really well. And he knew that was a fairy tale, as Jim Garrison liked to put it. But speaking of fairy tales and LBJ, one of my pet peeves, Jim, is the false sponsor story that I believe the CIA and certain Republicans cooked up back in the 60s. Shall we say the Nixon forces and the forces aligned with George Bush and the CIA put forward a number of false sponsors to distract the public from the real culprits, who I believe are the CIA. And you've got the Castro did it theory, the Russians did it, the mob did it, LBJ did it. And it's just, when you really examine this stuff and you go back to the sources, you go through Lyndon Johnson's White House tapes, which is a great resource, you learn that Lyndon Johnson most likely certainly had no foreknowledge. There's no evidence at all that he was involved in the conspiracy to kill Kennedy in any way, shape, or form. And yet there are still conspiracy people who are out there selling books, people like Roger Stone, of course, a good friend of President Nixon, who wrote a book accusing LBJ without any direct evidence that he was the mastermind of the JFK assassination, laid all the blame at LBJ's feet. And it's one of my pet peeves, and I'd love to debate Roger on this sometime. But this week, he was on the PBD podcast. That's a show I know you've been on.
Oh, Patrick?
Yeah, Patrick, Bet David. And Roger was on, I believe, on the 21st to talk JFK. And here he goes again, telling us that LBJ done it.
6-year anniversary tomorrow, John F. Kennedy assassination. I've had a lot of different people on, Roger, on this topic. You've written a book on it, a New York Times best-selling book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ. I had a guy on the podcast. I interviewed him 6 years ago, Jim Jenkins. Rob, if you can pull this up. When I was interviewing Jim Jenkins, I asked him a question. He was one of the 4 people in the room that held John F. Kennedy's brain, okay, Jim Jenkins. And we released this interview on, it could have been one of the anniversary dates. And a video was taken down for 6 hours. It was trending in a very good way. And then came back up the next day. And I said, who out of all the people, who do you think was behind it? This is a guy that's been away for 50 years. He was in the military, was in the Navy, doesn't want any attention, doesn't do any interviews, doesn't talk to anybody. Somehow, some way, we got him to feel comfortable to come and talk to us. And I had him on the show, and his wife was sitting right next to me. They've been married for 50-plus years. He says, the one man that makes me feel very uncomfortable is Lyndon Johnson, is who he said. Well, how did you come to the conclusion that Lyndon Johnson was behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Basically, Richard Nixon told me that. Wow. He said that the Warren Commission was the biggest goddamn hoax in American history. I'd always had my suspicions, but the point here is that everybody who's analyzed the Kennedy assassination looks at it through a specific prism. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is right when he says the CIA is involved. Others are right when they say organized crime was involved. Yet others are right when they say the FBI was involved, the Secret Service, Big Texas Oil, the international banks. But Lyndon Johnson is the linchpin. He is the nexus to all of those institutions and individuals, and he is the man who has the most acute interest. Lyndon Johnson is under federal investigation in the Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Sal Estes scandal Robert Kennedy's begun telling people he's going to be charged. John Kennedy tells Evelyn Lincoln, his personal secretary, on his way to Dallas on the plane, Johnson is being dropped from the ticket. Johnson is a man staring into the abyss. He knows he is going to prison. Drew Pearson, the most influential columnist of the day, already has a column in the can for that Sunday, the day after Kennedy's supposed to be in Dallas, nailing Johnson for taking a bribe for a General Dynamics defense appropriation. So Johnson has motive, means, and opportunity. He's the man who insists that Kennedy go to Dallas to bind up the wounds between the progressive and bourbon wings of the Democratic Party. He goes to Kennedy's hotel room the night before and tries to change the motorcade seating to put his hated enemy, Senator Ralph Yarborough, in the death car with Kennedy and move his former administrative assistant, Governor John Connally, to the vice presidential car. Kennedy says, no, that defeats the whole purpose of why I'm here. I need to be seen with Connally, the head of the more conservative wing of the party. And in my book, I prove, using eyewitness evidence, fingerprint evidence, and deep Texas politics, that Johnson and all these other entities, each of whom has their own motive, the CIA about the anger over the Bay of Pigs failure, the anger over Kennedy's secret deal to remove our missiles from Turkey and Italy in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Big Oil over the repeal of the oil depletion allowance, organized crime who feels double-crossed by JFK because they financed his election and they broke arms for him in Chicago and in Texas in 1960, in which he wins a razor-thin victory. So everybody has their own individual interest. The banks, because Kennedy's demanding a silver-backed dollar. They don't want to go there. But Johnson has a unique relationship with each one of them, and I actually prove that among the fingerprints found on the cardboard boxes in the crow's nest is the fingerprint for a man named Malcolm Mac Wallace, who was convicted in 1951 of murder. That's how we have his fingerprints.
Wow.
He murdered a man named Douglas Kinzer, who was in a love trial with Johnson's sister and who was trying to blackmail Lyndon Johnson. He was represented at trial by Johnson's personal attorney, John Cofer, and he's the only man in the history of Texas to be convicted of murder and get a suspended sentence, whereupon he then goes to work at Temco, a defense contractor owned by D.H. Byrd, one of the financiers of Johnson's career, and the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building. So when I asked Nixon point blank after a couple cocktails, because Nixon was very buttoned down, it was very hard to get him to talk, retrospectively about anything. He was very forward-looking.
Until 9:30.
Until he had a couple of silver bullets, as he would call them.
Yes.
He had a couple martinis, and then he got loquacious. And I said to him, so, Mr. President, let me ask you a question. Who really killed John Kennedy? He kind of stared into his martini, and he shuddered, and he said, well, Dallas. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. He said, let me put it to you another way. Lyndon and I both wanted to be president. The difference was I wasn't willing to kill for it.
Wow.
There it is. He laid it right out. And that was really my inspiration. It took me 5 years to write this book, but that was really my inspiration for writing the book. So when Robert Kennedy says the CIA did it, he's not wrong.
Well, he's not wrong when he says the CIA done it, and I say the CIA done it. What do you say, Jim? Who done it?
I'm really surprised that Patrick let him run on but Patrick
gave him an hour.
But Patrick, he knows a lot about the case, but he doesn't know all the ins and outs. He's really a businessman, a very successful businessman. Okay, now here's my first question. How would Nixon know that LBJ was behind the plot to kill Kennedy in the first place? Johnson and Nixon hated each other. Okay, so do you think he's going to come on, please? All right. Secondly, that I can't believe he's still talking about that fingerprint evidence.
That was debunked years ago by Joan Mellon, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't really Joan Mellon. She gave it to this expert, one of the highest, authorizations in that field, okay, to examine it. And the guy said no. It's not Mac. In fact, Mac Wallace was in California that day. Okay.
Yeah.
But yet Roger is still talking about this as
Mm.
if it is valid evidence.
And
All
people
right.
believe it too. I mean, when you look at the opinion polls, and I find it alarming, Jim, that almost 20% of Americans think that LBJ was involved in the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. That's almost as many people think that Oswald did it. I mean,
Yeah, that's actually correct.
that is correct. And
The
it's pretty
The
scary.
CIA is in third place with 17. Okay.
Right. Right.
You know.
And so I say that, Richard Nixon, I mean, what I think Roger Stone's doing here, and you'll notice the books that come out accusing LBJ of being a part of it, like Bar McClellan's book. He was tied directly to the Bush family. He's the brother, I believe, of Scott McClellan, who was President Bush's Bush 43's
No, I think he was
spokesman.
wasn't he an uncle or something? I don't think he was a brother, but yeah, he was related to him. There's
Yeah,
no
Scott
doubt about
McClellan.
that. And
And then the Nixon forces, like Roger Stone. Now, this is just my personal opinion. I don't know if you agree, but there isn't a single individual. When you ask Kay Bono, there's not a single individual who benefited more from the assassinations of JFK and RFK than Richard Nixon. And, I mean, there are links between the JFK assassination and Watergate. Some of the plumbers were directly involved in the JFK hit. Nixon himself had mob ties. The mafia provided hired guns for the JFK hit. And there's that 1947 memo, right, indicating that
right.
Jack Ruby was once
actually,
on Nixon's congressional payroll.
Lori Rubenstein.
Yes, Jack Rubenstein.
Yeah.
He was called Rubenstein then.
Yeah.
And he was an FBI informant himself, and he was running guns to the Cubans that were sponsored by the CIA.
Yes.
Nixon had his paws in all of this, and I'll go on. He was in Dallas on November 21st and 22nd, 1963. He was there to give a speech at the Pepsi Cola convention. That was the official reason for his visit. And strangely enough, future president and CIA man George H.W. Bush was also in Dallas. He was staying at the Dallas Sheraton Hotel the night before the assassination. Now, what are the odds that 3 future presidents would all be in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, but only one of those 3 men, LBJ, was there at the personal invitation of his president and his friend, JFK. Nixon and Bush, just a coincidence, I guess, that they happened to be on speaking engagements in Dallas. Just kind of strange fate. But it bothers me, Jim, because so many books have been written putting forth what I call evidence-free conspiracy theories, suggesting that LBJ was involved in the JFK assassination, but none that I'm aware of have been published tying Nixon to this crime. I think that historians let Nixon off easy for being an obvious suspect in the crime of the century. The key players in the Cuban exile community were Nixon men who assumed that he would beat JFK in 1960, and they all hated Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, which, by the way, was a coup that was hatched by Richard Nixon when he was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower.
Well, Nixon was actually what they called the action officer in the White House for the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Right.
Eisenhower didn't really run the operation or supervise it, but Richard Nixon did. See, Oliver thinks, and I talked to him about this once. Okay. Oliver thinks that Roger Stone is out there to make it a Democratic crime, to make it part of the Democratic Party.
Right.
All right. And I'm really surprised that Patrick let him run on with all those mistakes, that he made of fact.
And nobody corrected him. They were all sitting there just egging him on and believing it. And and I know you know this. The first person that Alan Dulles went to see after the Bay of Pigs was Vice President Nixon,
Was
former
was
Vice
Nixon.
President Nixon. Yeah.
You're exactly right. He was
Yeah.
out of the country in Puerto Rico because he thought if he was away, that he wouldn't get blamed for the failure and it would fall on Dick Bissell. But
That's right.
when he came back, the first guy he saw was not Kennedy. It was Richard Nixon. You're exactly correct on that.
And another thing, and Roger brings it up because he always likes to associate LBJ with the big Texas oil men, right? But Nixon also had the backing of those wealthy Texas oil men before he even sought their support. They sought him out early in his career and backed Nixon. So what I'm saying here, in essence, is that many of the groups, in fact, all of the groups suspected in the assassination conspiracy, the rogue CIA agents, the Cuban exiles, the mafia, the Texas oil men, even Prescott and George Bush, and much of the power elite at the time were all Nixon men. So it
Nixon
seems
was
to me
associated with all of them. Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
Now, maybe that's just a coincidence. There are a lot of coincidences here. But, Nixon, he flat out lied to the FBI when he was interviewed for the Warren Commission in 1964. And by the way, he was never cross-examined. Nixon said the only time he was in Dallas was 2 days before the JFK assassination. But the truth is well documented. Nixon was there. He left Dallas at 9:00 in the morning on November 22nd, 1963. So he lied about that.
He was there that morning. Yes.
He was there that morning. He left before the assassination happened, but only a couple hours before. And, he suffered amnesia, it seems, over the events of that day and numerous retellings of his whereabouts on that fateful day. He told several different stories. He claimed to have heard the news of JFK's death from a New York City cab driver. In another version, he said it was the hotel doorman. And, the night before the assassination, Nixon held a meeting with reporters at his hotel there in Dallas. And there's footage of it on YouTube. November 21st, 1963, he told them that JFK's presidency was failing and suggested that Kennedy was planning to drop LBJ from the ticket in 1964. And on that morning of November 22nd, 1963, as Nixon was leaving Dallas, this one always stuck out in my mind as bizarre. He walked up to the American Airlines ticket counter alone to check in for his flight to New York City. And he made a rather curious remark to the flight attendant. He said, "It looks like you're going to have a big day today."
That's one I didn't know about.
And then it just so happened that, just like Nixon, George Bush was also boarding a plane that morning in Dallas. Boy, the airports were busy that morning. Private plane that transported him to Tyler, Texas, which is about a 40-minute flight east of Dallas. He was there to speak at a Kiwanis Club event. And it was a lunchtime speech. So news of the assassination came while he was giving his speech. At least he has a thorough alibi, right? He was seen by hundreds of witnesses at the luncheon, and his speech, of course, was canceled. But, it's just interesting to me that, Nixon, and here's another interesting story. He was there, he attended JFK's inaugural. And even though he liked to say that the election of 1960 was stolen from him in Cook County, Illinois, and all the vote stealing supposedly that went on. But, he back then, if you lost an election, Nixon, he didn't do a recount. He didn't take it to court. He didn't pursue it. He let it go. And that was considered the gentlemanly thing to do back then. But I think that Nixon was plotting a return. He went to Kennedy's inauguration, and as he was leaving, he ran into Ted Sorensen, right? One of Kennedy's speechwriters and friends. And he told Sorensen, I think this is in Sorensen's memoirs, he said he wished he had said some of those eloquent words, that Jack Kennedy spoke that day. Sorensen asked him, which part? The part that starts, "I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear." which is funny. And, he was just kidding. But Nixon, he wrote in his memoirs that he left JFK's swearing in ceremony struck by the thought, as he wrote, that, quote, this was not the end, that someday I would be back here. And indeed, he would be in 1968 after Kennedy's brother, RFK, most likely Nixon's challenger in the 1968 race, was assassinated in Los Angeles. Now, that's another story for another day, another conspiracy, but it is interesting, Jim. I was just watching, on YouTube. I love to look up the old television coverage of election nights, like watching Huntley and Brinkley bring in the returns. I've watched them all, and we for the longest time couldn't track down election coverage from election night 68. But someone just recently uploaded ABC News's coverage of that night. Interestingly, Gore Vidal was one of their correspondents that night, one of their observers. It was Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley Jr. Giving analysis. I know, it was really good stuff. But I forgot that, of course, that was a pretty close election between Humphrey and Nixon.
Yes, it was.
With George Wallace disrupting things as an independent candidate. I think Wallace got about 14% of the vote. And the vote counting went on late into the night. And guess what? That whole election boiled down to Illinois.
Oh,
Illinois.
really?
Yeah, that's how Nixon won. It was close. And then Humphrey started pulling ahead of Nixon late in the evening. And, had Bobby Kennedy lived, it probably would have been another Kennedy versus Nixon match, just like it was in 1960. And that election came down to Chicago. But also the 1968 election also pivoted on the state of Illinois. Late at night when Humphrey was ahead, all of a sudden, boom, Richard Nixon won the state of Illinois. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I'm not saying that Nixon done it, but I'm saying that there is a much, much, much stronger case if we're going to convict a dead man on circumstantial evidence. I'm just saying that there's a much stronger case to be made, circumstantially anyhow, against Richard Nixon than there is to be made against Lyndon Johnson. What do you think?
Let me comment on another thing Roger said that's utterly false. Okay. And it figures him, a Nixon man, would say something like this. This whole idea from that novel, Double Cross, by Sam and Chuck Giancana, that they made a deal, okay, with Joe Kennedy to steal the election,
right,
has been completely debunked by Professor John Binder, who is a professor emeritus at the University of Chicago. He did a study of the reputedly mob-controlled wards in Chicago that Giancana was supposed to have controlled. And he said the results were very surprising because that year, Kennedy actually polled below the norm, okay, for a Democratic candidate, not above the norm. You would think exactly the opposite. All right. And so he talked to some aldermen who worked in those wards. And he said, look, we were told to discourage voting for Kennedy because nobody wanted to see Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General.
That's right.
And there was a distinct possibility that was going to happen. Now, let me tell you the other myth about West Virginia. Okay, this is the other thing. And I believe Nixon started the whole West Virginia mythology.
Yeah.
There was a guy named Dan Fleming, because it didn't come up till October of 1960, a month before the election. And I believe Nixon realized that he had a tiger by the tail. And so he had to get this story out that somehow Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, cheated in West Virginia. Let me explain why this is not so. There were 3 investigations of that election. One by the FBI. Does anybody really think Hoover liked JFK or RFK? Okay. All right.
He did like Lyndon, though. They were neighbors. They got along well.
They were the best of buddies. Yeah. One by the state attorney general The third one by, get this, Barry Goldwater. All right. Barry Goldwater hired an alumni of the FBI to invest. And guess what? None of them could come up with anything, all
Yep.
right, about this rigging of this election. Now, let me tell you how Bobby won that election for his brother. There was a very big union guy, Ray Chafin, who wrote a book about this. He said he was pledged to Humphrey. JFK said, "Can I take about 20 minutes of your time to make a pitch?" And he said, "Okay." JFK said, whatever Humphrey promised you, I swear on my word, I will do better if I'm elected. Okay. And I'll do much better. In fact, when you come into my office in the White House, I will listen to whatever you want me to do in West Virginia. And Chafin was really impressed by that. And he said, "Oh,
And he
okay."
meant it too. Jack.
And well, I'll tell you that at the end of the story.
Yeah.
So he had asked Bobby Kennedy how much money would he get. And Bobby Kennedy said, "Well, how much do you want?" Okay. And he said 35. He meant 3,500. A week before the election, this plane flies in with these Kennedy guys, and they bring a huge suitcase to this Ray Chafin guy. And Ray opens it up, and it's $35,000. He said, and so Ray said, this was so much money that I had to drive around all the western part of the state because I couldn't spend it all myself. All right. And so that's one of the reasons why JFK won that election. All right. Back then, you could do stuff like this. Now, the closest.
Yeah. So it basically didn't, in other words, in the big picture, Illinois didn't even matter.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, that's true. That's true. It didn't matter in the Electoral College. All right.
Yep.
Now, let me close the story.
Please.
John F. Kennedy then calls in. He gets the message to Ray. And he says, "I want to come up." Now that he's inaugurated, "I want you to come up to my office." And so Ray's sitting there in the hallway. And I think it was Dave Powers who escorted him to the Oval Office. And he says, "You have 15 minutes. And JFK said, "No, this man has as much time as he needs." Okay. And Ray said, there were so many improvements that JFK made to West Virginia that has never, ever been equaled since. Freeways, roads, post offices, etc. were all constructed because JFK stuck them in those bills. He kept his word. I mean, how many politicians
He certainly did. He certainly did. And something else I will add to that story, during the 60 campaign, Kennedy did spend a lot of time down in West Virginia, and he was shocked and also deeply moved by the poverty, the extreme poverty that he saw, the families down there that were living in shacks with not enough to eat. And much like we saw in his brother Robert Kennedy's poverty tour of the Mississippi Delta many years later, Kennedy never forgot that. And his very first action as president on day one, January 21st, 1961, his first executive order was he provided for an expanded program of food distribution to needy families. And that was mainly for the people of West Virginia because it broke his heart when he saw those kids going hungry down there. And, the SNAP program back then was just not anything like what it is today.
Right.
And so he did keep his promises to West Virginia. And that was more than just political wheeling and dealing and horse trading. It was something that really, truly touched his heart, something that a memory that Jack Kennedy never forgot was that visit to West Virginia. And
wonderful. Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, but since we were talking about Oliver Stone and the attacks on Oliver's JFK, and then again, when he did JFK Revisited, of course, the usual suspects come crawling out of the woodwork to attack him again. And I wanted to show you this clip because you've been so busy. I don't know if you have had a chance to see it yet. As we see every year, the few surviving, people who were there that day. Secret Service agent Clint Hill usually does a lot of interviews around the anniversary. And he's interviewed here, and I wanted to show it to you because he specifically attacked your film, JFK Revisited. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but I wanted to play it for you and give you a chance to respond since you're the screenwriter and researcher on that film. If he thinks you got it wrong, I do want to give you a chance to correct it.
60
So,
years later,
let's
the
take a look at-
images of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy are just as haunting. But 91-year-old Clint Hill can recall every detail without opening his eyes.
How often do you think about that day?
At least once every day, maybe more. Still there embedded in my brain, and it never leaves.
Hill was trailing the presidential limousine in the motorcade as the Secret Service agent assigned to First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. When 3 shots were fired on that November day in Dallas, Texas, the young agent jumped onto the back of the limo in a desperate attempt to protect the president and Mrs. Kennedy, cementing his place in that dark day in history.
There was no thinking there, you just did it.
Yeah, just reaction.
Do you recall having any thoughts in that moment?
Just get there. Get on top of the car. Get your body above theirs, between them and any possible person that's trying to do them harm.
The 91-year-old has written a new afterword for his book 5 Days in November, ahead of the 60th anniversary of the assassination.
What is there that you're saying in here that you haven't already said?
Well, I was very concerned that the general population still has not accepted the truth about the assassination. It's hard for me to believe that the numbers of people who still believe in conspiracies, they don't really accept the actual fact of what did happen.
Hill's recollection has never wavered. 1 man, 1 gun, 3 shots, all from the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. But he worries about those who give credence to conspiracy theories that suggest otherwise.
You said, I fear that once all of us who were witnesses to history are gone, the truth will be buried along with us. I'm sure it's not lost on you that there's only 2 surviving Secret Service members from that day. You worry about that time when neither of you will be here?
I just hope that people will read this and believe it, because it's truth, and not listen to the other garbage that comes out.
Of late, those conspiracy theories have been fueled by a new account of the assassination made in a recent book by Hill's former partner, Secret Service agent Paul Landis. Landis telling the New York Times he's, quote, beginning to doubt myself about Lee Harvey Oswald being the lone gunman. Hill dismisses Landis's account as fiction.
What Mr. Landis had written in his book cannot be true.
You think he's being dishonest or just has a different recollection of what happened?
I don't know.
What does it say to the American public that the 2 of you don't have your stories aligned?
Well, it just gives them further reason to believe in the conspiracy theories. And that's unfortunate.
That's a deep, deep concern to you.
Very deep concern to me.
Conspiracy theories are now conspiracy facts.
Hill also takes issue with how director Oliver Stone's feature film and documentary about the assassination have further fueled those theories.
It was not fact. It was fiction. I mean, if you're going to make it fiction, announce it that way. This is a made-up story. Don't tell people that this is fact when it's not. And that's what he has done.
Did he ever call you?
No. And don't bother now. It's too late for that junk.
Hill says he's accepted that his actions on that day will likely be how he's remembered.
What does that acceptance look like or mean to you?
Well, people keep thanking me for what I did, but I appreciate that very much. But I didn't complete my task, which was to save the president's life. And that's what's bothered me all these years, 60 years now. Job was to keep the president alive and safe. And I was not able to do that.
Your legacy, what do you want it to be?
Well, I just, I tried. I tried to do the best job I could. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough.
Do you ever think about how, had this not happened, what your life might be like?
Oh, yeah. Much calmer, much simpler. I wouldn't have had the experiences I've had, though. I was a lucky man to be given the responsibilities I was given. I'm very grateful.
And we're grateful for him. To this day, Clint Hill believes if he had moved faster, he could have taken those bullets and saved the president's life. While he cannot turn back time, he feels that it's his duty to set the record straight about the facts of the assassination while he is still alive to do it. But ultimately, while he's made such huge contributions to American history and society, the thing he says that brings him the most happiness these days is his wife, Lisa, and spending time together with her in California. It's always, I mean, you've spent time with him. It's always a joy to spend time with him, but the weight that he carries is so monumental.
Oh, for so many decades. It's nice to see him have some peace, but he still feels this responsibility to get the truth out there. Yeah.
He sure does, especially with conspiracy theories, still out there. And he wanted to make that a point, that he pushes back hard on all that.
And at 91, sharp as that.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Right.
Indeed. All right, Jacob, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't miss the Today Show every weekday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 Pacific on our streaming channel, Today All Day. To watch, head to today.com/allday or click the link right here.
So that was Clint Hill on the Today Show. And, I know that in the JFK conspiracy research movement, Clint Hill gets a lot of critique, and sometimes rightly so, because they said his story had remained consistent all these years, and you and I both know that it has not. It has evolved a few times, but he still sticks to the Warren Commission fiction. And
this book is the annotated screenplays for both scripts that I wrote. There's over 500 footnotes.
That's right.
He is one of them. Okay. Do you know why? Because he's one of the guys who said there was this big hole in the back of Kennedy's skull that he could see into. So what on earth is he talking about?
That's why he covered Kennedy with his jacket at Parkland Hospital, because Jackie wouldn't leave the car. The wound was so terrible, she didn't want people to see Jack that way. And it was Agent Hill, wasn't it, who took off his own jacket
Secondly,
and covered the head wound.
There was blood on the trunk, okay, that he writes about in his book. All right. Well, how did it get there if the shot was from behind? And
It's
how
that
could
darn wind again, Jim. It was a windy day. It was a tornado, man.
and how could he possibly protect JFK from shots coming from the grassy knoll if he was behind the president? Okay. Clint Hill, and by the way, does he ever talk about staying up till 3 o'clock in the morning and getting bombed? Okay.
Nope. He doesn't like to talk about that part.
Okay.
He had a drinking problem.
It was called The Cellar.
Yep.
Okay. And they were after hours and they served hard liquor. Okay. And those guys were there till like maybe 3 or 4 in the morning.
Yeah,
now,
the
call for the next morning was 7 o'clock. How can you be at your best with 3 hours or 4 hours of sleep? Okay.
That's
so
right.
Clint Hill is a very muddled, confused guy who does not want, and most of those Secret Service guys are like that.
Yep.
The only guy, maybe Landis, but he's a muddled guy too. And
Right. And now, I've seen several news reports. In fact, one just came across my phone while we were sitting here talking tonight. Another mainstream media attack on Paul Landis and his new revelations. And they're saying that it's a false memory that Paul Landis has.
The false memory.
Yeah. He's old, he's senile. It's a false memory, they're saying.
Did Abe Bolden have a false memory too?
Well, they locked him up.
Yeah.
His memories.
They got him off stage. Okay.
Exit
We don't
stage
want to
left.
go around. All right. So anyway,
right.
poor Clint Hill. By the way, this new wife of his, okay, was the
Lisa McCubbin?
person. Yeah, she was behind these books that he chose. I think he's written like 5 books in 6 years.
Yeah.
I don't think he ever wrote one before he met her.
He married his ghostwriter.
Right.
Yeah.
And she also tried to get a film made,
Mhm.
okay, called The Kennedy Detail. Thank God that hasn't come out yet. Okay. So Clint has done a lot through Lisa McCubbin to go ahead and become a rather prolific author. All right. I think he's written more books than any other Secret Service. I'll go further than that. I think he's written more books than all the Secret Service agents combined. All right.
Yeah, but you know who's written the most books about it and the best books about it, in my opinion, is our friend Vince Palomara. He's written more books
Wow.
on the Secret Service and the JFK assassination than anyone
Yeah,
by far.
I think about 4 he's written
Mhm.
on the Secret Service, and you're correct. Vince is very good on that subject. All right,
The
and
best, in my opinion.
he's one of the guys that have shown that the Secret Service, for whatever reason, they called off the actual plan for the motorcycles on either side of JFK. All right.
Mhm.
There were supposed to be, I believe, 6,
6.
3 on one side, 3 on the other. It was cut down to 4 for
Right.
whatever reason. All right. And you also, I'm sure you've seen this, I'm sure most of your listeners have. There's also that devastating film of Lawton, okay, being called off
Mm.
the back of Kennedy's limousine, which
At
is
Love Field, yeah, as the
utterly
motorcade was leaving.
inexplicable.
And
Yeah,
he's
right,
like, "Hey, what
exactly.
the
And he can't
wait
figure
for
it
me."
out. All right. And
Yeah, yeah.
Vince also showed that the motorcade route was changed.
Yeah.
In fact, it was changed the night before. And BJ Martin, one of the motorcyclists who was, I think, on the same side as Hargis, he said, "This is the craziest motorcade route and the craziest formation I've ever seen in my whole life." He couldn't understand it. Well, there's a good reason he couldn't understand it because it was so unusual.
Mm.
Okay. So these are all very, very serious problems, which I consider negligence on the part of the Secret Service.
Well, and when you talk about Secret Service negligence, the one that gets me, I mean, God bless Agent Hill. I honestly do have a lot of sympathy for Clint Hill. He's in his 90s now. As you could see there in that clip, he's not in the best of health. This may have been his last opportunity to speak to the media and tell his story. And he has written several books in recent years. And I feel for Clint Hill because, to his credit, he was the only Secret Service agent on the detail that day who at least tried to do something, to do his job. He was late, but at least he did try. He lunged for the limousine. He climbed on board. He just got there too late. And God bless him because he lives with a kind of survivor's guilt and PTSD that none of us could ever understand. And
Yes,
so
that's true.
I'm willing to forgive him some cloudy memories. I know he did have an alcoholism problem for many years, like many members of the Secret Service detail did. They were heavy drinkers, as we know. But I did want to say that the one that really gets me, and it's amazing how he skated on the whole deal, was Agent Roy Kellerman, the agent who was seated in the front passenger seat. I mean, of course, I have my issues with Bill Greer hitting the brakes when they were, after the first shot rang out. Greer slowed the car down. But the one that really gets me, the one I'm still angry at after 60 years, is Agent Roy Kellerman, because it was his job. He had one job, and that was to fly over that seat and cover Kennedy the way that Agent Rufus Youngblood did for Vice President Johnson, 2 cars behind them. But Roy Kellerman failed in his job that day, and I never really heard him express any remorse or regret.
That's bad enough, and that's true. Okay. But Kellerman was the guy at Parkland Hospital who was ready to beat the living daylights out of Earl Rose unless he let the gurney go outside, and be escorted to the airfield.
Steal the body.
Right. And
Steal the
Kellerman
president's
was a
body.
big guy. Kellerman was like 6'3", 220.
Yep.
Okay. And he was ready to shove this guy up the wall and start beating him over the head. When
That's
in
right.
fact, and as I'm sure you know this, that was the proper thing to do. The proper thing to do was to have the autopsy in Dallas.
In
So
Texas.
he was completely within his rights to ask them to stop it, and so he could perform the autopsy. But if you read, for example, Manchester's book, Death of a President, he even says in that book that as bad as what I'm describing here, I got stories that are even worse for what happened in that hallway to get that body out of there. Okay. But
Mhm.
Kellerman was the chief culprit. All right.
Yes.
And I believe and probably you do also, Earl Rose was a good pathologist.
Mhm.
I think Kennedy would have gotten a good autopsy.
We probably would have gotten an honest autopsy, Jim, had the
Right.
authorities in Texas been able to do their job.
Right. I totally agree.
Yep. And that's what Lyndon Johnson thought too. Initially, he was wanting the Texas authorities to investigate the
Yes,
matter.
that's
He didn't
true.
want it to be a federal investigation at all. And some say, well, that's because he was involved. They were his friends. But I just want to say one last thing in Lyndon Johnson's defense. And I'm no great fan of Lyndon Johnson. I'm just a student of the case. And I used to think he was involved too, but I've come to realize that there's just no evidence that really makes Johnson look guilty of any conspiracy. And it's important to point out that Lyndon Johnson was not well liked or well connected in Dallas. Dallas was not in any way, shape, or form Johnson country. Dallas was conservative. It was Republican. Johnson country was south of Dallas in Austin and the Hill country. That was Democrat country in Texas back then. A lot of people get that wrong. They think that Johnson was good friends with the Dallas police chief. He was not. They think that Johnson was in with the Dallas oil money. He was not. Johnson was a pariah in those circles. They did not like him at all.
That famous, we can close out the show with this, but
Yeah.
there's a famous picture of LBJ with his hat on, punching the sky.
Yeah.
And with Kennedy trying to hold him back.
I love that picture.
Now, do you know what that picture is really about?
Tell me. I don't know if I know the story.
Johnson was berating the crowd for booing Kennedy.
Yes.
That's what it's really about.
Yeah.
And these people try and distort it into being something that it's really not. So
true.
That's the final chapter. Okay.
I'd have to agree with you there. I mean, when you really look at it and you listen to Johnson's White House tapes, you read his memoirs and those who served, certainly the Kennedy leftovers, even those who didn't like him. He was, even when he disagreed with Jack Kennedy, he was always loyal. In politics, loyalty means a lot. And he was loyal to Jack Kennedy. And Jack actually liked Lyndon a great deal and respected him a great deal. The problem was always Bobby Kennedy and Johnson. Those two, I think George Reedy described it once as, how two dogs that they don't like the smell of each other, and they come into a room and there's this low growl, and those two men just never could. They never liked each other from the get-go. And the real problem was Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, not Jack Kennedy. The enmity was not shared by President Kennedy. That's
all right. So we've extended this a little bit longer. So let me cap it with this story. Okay. At the convention in 1960, Kennedy's advisors, like Phil Graham, had convinced him to pick Johnson for political purposes. Okay. In other words, we can save the South if we go with Johnson. Bobby Kennedy was violently was violently opposed to this.
Yeah.
So in Jeff Schessel's book, about this feud,
Mutual Contempt. That's a great book.
Right. He says that what Bobby Kennedy did was conduct a stairway subterfuge of what JFK really wanted. And he'd be going up and down the stairs trying to tell Johnson, no, he doesn't really mean it. Okay. He just wants you to say no, and stuff like that. And then he'd go down and talk to his brother, and finally, Johnson had to call JFK, and he said, no, this is for real. I want you as my vice president. Bobby was doing all this funny stuff. And that shows you how much he didn't want him on the ticket.
Right, right.
And Jeff Schessel's book is, I believe, that's the best book about the feud between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah. And that broke Lyndon Johnson's heart. He really felt like if Jack had offered him the job, he wanted to hear it from Jack, not his brother. That's why he called him. He said,
Yes.
I don't want to talk to your little brother. I want to hear it from you. And Jack was like, never mind my little brother. Yeah, everybody's got a little brother.
But that shows you the seeds that started that whole thing.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And it's unfortunate because there's Johnson. I will say this, full disclosure, I did know Lady Bird Johnson and Lucy, his daughter. When I lived in Austin, Texas, I worked for years at a radio station called KLBJ, which was the station
I didn't
owned
know
by.
that.
I did. On my YouTube channel, you can actually find some of my old newscasts. When I worked at KLBJ, I posted a few so that people could laugh at me from 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago now.
So you
Wow.
actually worked for Lady Bird Johnson's
I
radio
did.
empire?
I did. I worked
Oh
for the
my
Johnson
God.
family. So
Oh.
I never knew Lyndon. Of course, he died long when I was a little child, but I did know Lady Bird. She was actively involved with the day-to-day operations of that radio station. It wasn't just an investment for her. She truly loved journalism. She went to the University of Texas, my alma mater. She majored in journalism and had always dreamed of being a journalist. That's what she wanted to do with her life. And I'll say a couple of nice things about them. They're really good people. And Lady Bird Johnson, we have to thank really for so many of the early disclosures of the Johnson papers and the Johnson tapes. When the JFK Records Act was passed, Lady Bird Johnson made a point to ensure that the LBJ library was in full compliance, that those documents and tapes were released years and years earlier than 2039, which was the original deed of gift.
Yeah, that's how we got a lot of those Johnson conversations.
That's right.
Which are
And that's where
very
the
interesting.
gold is. Yeah, that's where the gold is. There's so much important information that changes our knowledge about the Kennedy assassination that comes directly from the Johnson Library. It's helpful that Johnson recorded everything in so many ways. Johnson was a very transparent president. When you go to the Johnson Library, and I lived in Austin and I spent a lot of time there. It was literally right out my back door. So I spent years going through the Johnson papers and tapes. And this was in the 90s and the early 2000s, just as these tapes were coming out. And, Johnson recorded more conversations than any other president in United States history.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He did. He's got more hours. We've got more hours of Johnson tapes by far than we have from Nixon or Kennedy or anyone else. The Johnson tapes are voluminous. It takes years.
Well, he
to
was
go
a very
through them.
talkative guy.
He just let other people talk, which was very smart. Lyndon was a good listener and he asked good questions, which is probably why he was a good school teacher. But he had a very curious mind. And, Johnson, especially when you talk about the JFK case, you listen to his phone calls with Hoover on November 24th, right after the assassination. Johnson's grilling Hoover. He's asking a lot of really good questions. And I think he continued to question the assassination. He always had questions. And even though some say that he was complicit in the cover-up and the conspiracy because of the Warren report, and I agree that he definitely knew there was more to the story.
Well, remember what he said to Walter Cronkite off camera?
Yes, I was just going to play that, and I
okay.
lost.
Go ahead.
I think I just lost the clip. I lost it.
Oh, you
so
did?
Yeah, I had it queued up, and then I closed the window. So tell the story.
Cronkite said something like, "Well, what about the Warren Commission? And what did you think of that?" And Johnson, I don't know why he said this, but it was words to the effect that, well, you look at this Oswald guy, and Cronkite says, "Well, what about it?" He goes, "He was a very interesting character, wasn't he?" And Johnson wouldn't go any further than that, and he had them shut off the camera, and he wouldn't let Cronkite play that part of the interview
True story.
on television until after his death, and
Yes.
that's how we found out about it.
That's
But
right.
here you have this guy saying, "I don't believe that bullet either," and then you have him saying that Oswald was a really interesting guy, wasn't he?
And he told Cronkite in that interview, I mean, Lyndon was a conspiracy theorist. He really, really was. And he said he never ruled out that
Yeah,
there could have been an international conspiracy. Now,
That's true.
what Lyndon did not say, although he sort of hinted at it, that there was a domestic conspiracy. He always tended to point to Cuba or maybe Russia, but he characterized it as an international conspiracy, but a conspiracy nonetheless. And he didn't believe the single bullet theory. He didn't believe the conclusions of his own Warren Commission, and yet, out of fear for the lives of his wife and his two daughters, he would not speak of it publicly. And who could blame him? I mean, he was riding 2 cars behind Kennedy in Dallas. He got the message that day in Dallas. And, you know, there's an interesting incident, Jim, and I don't even know if you are aware of this one because it was kind of forgotten about. I ran across it recently, about a year ago, going through old newspapers from 1964. And in February of 1964, there was a threat against Air Force One. Lyndon Johnson was taking a trip to Miami. And the FBI and the Secret Service received what they thought was a credible threat that some revolutionary Cubans were planning to ram a small jet into the side of Air Force One while the president was on board. Now, it intrigued me.
That's one I never heard of.
I know, I hadn't either. It was quite a discovery. I'll send it to you. It really took me back because I thought, now this is only what, 3 months after the national trauma of the murder of President Kennedy. He'd only been president for 3 months. And they were already, it seems to me, sending Johnson a message. It made the top stories in all the newspapers that day. Of course, the country was on edge. And it's amazing this report was even made public. But they rerouted Johnson's aircraft. They ended up having to sneak him in by helicopter. They took this threat very, very seriously. And I just thought that it was supposed to be like a Cuban suicide pilot, supposedly. And it sounded a lot like Operation Northwoods. You know,
well, yeah, right. That's what
they were going to
was.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And it was so interesting. I was like, were they going to stage a terror attack, sort of like 9/11? You know, on 9/11, they say that President Bush's Air Force One was a target, or they thought it was a target for a while that day. Turns out, supposedly, it was not actually a target, but President Bush didn't know that. And that's why they took him on a wild goose chase all over the United States, afraid to bring Air Force One back to Washington on that day. But it could have happened in 1964. And could you imagine, Jim, if that actually had happened, if we had lost 2 presidents in 3 months in such shocking and horrific circumstances? Imagine if that had happened, if a kamikaze pilot had flown into Air Force One, blown it out of the sky in a spectacular ball of fire over the city of Miami, killed the president. I mean, that's a book in itself, brother. That's a really interesting. I thought, now there's a movie of the week story. Why doesn't somebody make a movie about that time? You know, it'd be such an interesting book. Speaking of books, before we go, I have one favor to ask of you for your next book.
My next book?
Your next book. I have an idea that I want your next book to be about. Would you counter Roger Stone and write a book about Nixon and Bush and their involvement in the JFK assassination?
Well, okay, let's put it this way. If I do write another book, I'll reserve a chapter for that.
Okay, deal.
Right.
Sounds good.
And I know you're going to hold me to it also.
You bet you.
Okay.
I will. So speaking of the book, tell people where they can find your new book, JFK Assassination Chokeholds.
Yeah, okay. This one is available in both paperback and on Kindle. And it's also, you can order a hardcover off almost every major one. Amazon, of course, Barnes and Noble, Abbey, ABE, whatever that stands for, etc. Almost all of them. All right. And like I said, there's 4 co-authors in addition to me. 3 of them are lawyers. And when they tried to take a kind of legal view of the Kennedy case. And by the way, let me add just one thing before I sign off. Andrew Eiler investigated the origins of the beyond reasonable doubt standard of proof. You know, there's 3. There's a preponderance of the evidence, there's clear and convincing evidence, and then there's beyond a reasonable doubt. He found out that that originated for the sake of the community, so they would not feel bad or guilty about sending an innocent man to his dissolution. When I read that, I said, my God, how could that apply more to any case than the JFK case? Because everybody, well, 65% of the public thinks Oswald didn't do it. And we've had this terrible miasma, you know, this confusion, this obfuscation, all these decades since. And so that was an example of actually, in this case, which is rare, putting a round peg into a round hole for a change. So thank you, for Andrew. And that's
Indeed.
just part of the book. So thank
And
you for letting
I
me
want to give a
promote that.
plug too to one of your other co-authors, Matt Crumpton. Saw him on George Galloway's show this week. Did a great
Yes,
interview
how
with
did he
George.
do?
And really well, really
Okay,
well.
I haven't
And,
seen that. I have to see it.
Yeah, you'll like that. And I love his new podcast, Solving JFK. I guess it's not new. He's been doing that podcast for about a year now.
Yes.
I spent much of this week going through and listening to, I think I'm almost through every episode of season 1. And he does a really impressive job.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. You got some great co-authors. So to be clear, the book is not authored entirely by you. It's like a collection of essays from 5 different authors, right? That all
Yes.
contribute. Yeah.
Yes. To name the other ones, it's Paul Blow from Canada and Mark Adamczyk, who's an attorney from Florida, in addition to Matt and Andrew and myself. Those are the 5 authors.
Yeah, it's really good so far. I'm
Thank
not
you so
all
much.
the way through, but I'm enjoying it so much. And I always enjoy talking to you, Jim. I mean, when we get started on JFK, it seems like we can't get through it in less than 3 hours. And we almost did it. This is only supposed to be a 2-hour show. We always run overtime.
I know you'll send me my overtime check. Okay.
That's right. Checks in the mail, my friend. Checks in the mail. Such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm so glad that you were here for the 60th anniversary to set the record straight and keep people informed. And I look forward to the 70th anniversary when we're both much older and grayer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Lori. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, everyone, for watching Strange Bedfellows. We'll see you back here next Saturday night at 9 p.m. Eastern. Till then, peace.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.